Today, women make up more than half of the American electorate and are more engaged than ever in our politics. Yet we remain marginalized in government and elective office.
It's important for women to have a voice in this democracy because we see women being disproportionately affected across our society in so many areas.
The reality is the news industry is already gendered. The 19th is working to level the playing field.
Our newsroom is named for the 19th Amendment, but with an asterisk, the recognition of the omission of certain women from the franchise, from access to the ballot.
We are firm believers that all issues are women's issues. Our readers are people who care about those issues, who care deeply about the intersection of gender, politics, and policy, and want a more nuanced approach to that politics and policy journalism.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Live with the 19th.
With live events and interviews, the 19th is fostering civil conversations and community building that brings our readers into direct contact with the people who represent them.
There's never been a Black woman governor in American history.
I think that our newsroom being as diverse as it is, it means that we're looking and telling stories of women that maybe had not been previously represented in media before.
Our goal is to launch the first newsroom that is truly reflective of the nation's women.
There's more women running now than ever have been before, and people want to be informed.
Because what we know is that women are eager to have conversations about politics and often do not feel like they have a safe space to do that. We want to create that community for women, and we want to create that community for women everywhere.
Newsrooms need to be more inclusive. They need to better reflect their communities. The 19th has the opportunity to do that from the ground floor, and we're not wasting that opportunity.
There's never been a better moment than right now.
The 19th is the newsroom that we've been waiting for.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the 19th Represents Public Ed in the Pandemic. I'm Emily Ramshaw, the co-founder and CEO of the 19th, a new nonprofit newsroom that launched in August at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. We founded the 19th to shine a light on the unfinished business of the 19th Amendment, which gave some, but not all women, the right to vote a century ago. Over the summer, we kicked the 19th off with a week's worth of virtual events celebrating the Voting Rights Centennial, programming that was so critical and so well received that we're extending it into the fall. Right now, no issue is more critical to children and families than public education, with a global pandemic that's keeping many kids home from school, forcing many women out of the workplace, and exposing and worsening massive disparities in educational advancement and opportunity. Today, we have some extraordinary programming in store for you, where we'll hear from policymakers, educators, performing artists, and more to explore creative solutions to help parents and educators help kids. We'll kick things off today with two phenomenal keynote conversations. The first is with Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren, a former public school teacher and professor who used her high-profile slot at the Democratic National Convention in August to highlight the struggles of working moms to find affordable and high-quality childcare and the difference it can make for families and kids. The second is with former Secretary of Education Margaret Spellings, who is now the president and CEO of the nonprofit Texas 2036 and also served as president of the University of North Carolina system. She was the first mother of school-age kids to serve as education secretary. Then, Grammy Award-winning singer-songwriter Brandi Carlile will perform The Joke in concert with amazing young women from the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles. Our first panel discussion of the day invites superintendents, principals, and educators from across the country to explore how underserved children are being left behind in the pandemic era. After that, Academy Award-winning actress Natalie Portman will read an excerpt from her newly released children's book, Natalie Portman's Fables. Then we'll hear from a panel of educators and administrators who are on the front lines, risking their physical and mental health to keep kids on course. Finally, Chalkbeat's Kara Fitzpatrick sits down with Dr. Joyce Dorado in a conversation designed to give parents and teachers the tools to help kids. Dr. Dorado is the director and co-founder of the Healthy Environments and Response to Trauma in Schools program at the University of California, San Francisco. Before we kick off today's programming, here's a short message from our presenting sponsor, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative.
The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, working to build a more healthy, just, and inclusive future for everyone at czi.org.
I also want to thank our other sponsors, philanthropic partners, and media partners who made today possible. Raise Your Hand Texas, the RISA Foundation, and Chalkbeat, a nonprofit newsroom dedicated to covering education. I also want to let you know that the 19th is a member-supported newsroom, and we can't put on great free programming like this without your support. We hope you'll join us at 19thnews.org. Every $19 helps. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce my colleague Amanda Becker for today's first keynote conversation with Senator Elizabeth Warren.
We are thrilled to have Senator Elizabeth Warren here with us today to talk about education and childcare during the pandemic. Welcome, Senator Warren.
Thank you. It is good to be with you.
So we have a limited amount of time and people have a lot of questions about what is happening right now. So we'll just get straight into things.
Sounds good.
The Senate has a, new, what they're calling the skinny coronavirus relief bill. And it's about $500 million worth of relief is my understanding. What is in that bill? And is there anything at all related to schools and childcare? We're 7 to 8 months into this. A lot of people's children are still at home. We get, reader feedback every day about when more help is coming.
Yeah. So the bottom line is, I know that Mitch McConnell likes to call it the skinny bill. The real answer is it's just not enough help. It's not enough relief for the families who need it. So there's a very small amount in there for childcare, enough that they can say, check, we did childcare. Most experts say it might be enough to last for a few weeks, but not to sustain our childcare system or get places up and operational again. There's nothing for state and local government, which, as you know, this is how teachers get paid. This is how school bus drivers get paid, and cafeteria workers, the people who help support our school system and keep it up and going. It doesn't have enough money to cover the additional expenses that schools are going to encounter. Besides which, we've just learned, millions more people now in poverty, millions of people who are worried that they can't make the rent payment, can't make the mortgage payments, millions of people falling behind, and there's just not enough help for any of them. And so this is really a case of, do you leave folks behind, knowing that we're not going to be able to get this up and running again as long as the Republicans keep saying no, no, no. So it's a real problem. There's one other thing about it, though, Amanda, that really worries me, and that is this was never a serious offer. It's got poison pills in it. So it's got things in it like shoveling money that should go into public schools into private schools. Really? Our public schools, we need to get them up and operational. That's our first obligation. And it's got a liability release in it. So a meatpacking plant, for example, can bring in workers, can know that they're sick, can mash them in next to each other, and then other people get sick and people die. And what this bill says is there's no liability, no matter how irresponsible the employer was. We just can't go along with that. So, Mitch McConnell, I think, wanted something for politics to be able to vote on, but no, it's not help for our families. It's not help for the mamas and the daddies who need to get kids back to school. It's not help for our kids. It's not help for our teachers. And that's why it really was a non-starter, and Mitch McConnell knew it from the beginning.
It's taken us, and it sounds like this still won't be enough. It's taken us months to get to this next round of relief. And it sounds like there's not going to be enough overall. There certainly doesn't seem to be enough for schools or childcare to get them through this at a time when, depending on where you're living, your kids could still be at home full time right now. I mean, some kids are doing full-time remote learning. What has the holdup been, and why haven't we seen this happen sooner?
I hate to make this sound so political, but it's so political. The Democrats put a proposal on the table more than 4 months ago that would have been money for state and local governments, money for our teachers, that would have had robust funding for our child care centers so we could get them up and operational. And the Republicans they just didn't want to hear about it. No vote, no nothing over in the Senate. Already passed the House. In fact, that bill is still sitting there. Mitch McConnell could come in tomorrow, pick that bill up and say, okay, let's all vote on this. But he won't do that. And I see this, Amanda, it's a question of where are your priorities? Are your priorities with kids, with families that are trying to work from home, God bless them, or trying to go out to work and they need somebody. They need help with their kids. They need their kids back in school. They need their kids in childcare. Or are your priorities to keep the airlines up and running? And look, I understand why we help the airlines. That's a lot of jobs, and I'm not opposed to that. But boy, Republicans signed right up and said, we'll get in there. When money's going to big businesses, we'll get in there to help giant corporations. We'll get in there to do a release of liability for employers. But for families, they're just not there to help. And to me, that's what the election on November 3rd is all about. Who do you think government ought to work for?
In the early weeks of this pandemic, I spoke to a lot of parents and also childcare providers, including from your state, Massachusetts. And they were already struggling. This was in that first couple of weeks when things were starting to shut down. They were telling me how childcare centers operate on the margins already, that even just a few weeks could be completely devastating. And I had experts telling me as many as half of private childcare centers could close during all of this. And that, of course, the effects, like almost everything, would be disproportionately felt depending on your geographic area and demographics. You know, we're headed into 7 or 8 months of this now. What are you hearing from your constituents and people across this country? Have those predictions been as dire as anticipated? Are childcare providers managing to hang on? Are some of these that are still closed ever going to reopen again?
So, boy, I've talked to the same folks you've talked to. I've talked to folks here in Massachusetts, the childcare providers, the parents, the teachers, the folks who are trying to make this system work, and they just can't. The economics just aren't there to hold this together. And childcare providers, let's remember what it was like before the pandemic hit. We were already in the middle of a childcare crisis in America. Think about it. We had the problem of they run on razor thin margins. So they've got to get these children signed up. The parents can only afford to pay so much. As a consequence, childcare workers are among the lowest paid in our country. There's big turnover in childcare workers. You know, one of the main places they go to work is at McDonald's, because they can make more money running the cash register at McDonald's than they can taking care of our children. So childcare providers have always been at this very thin edge on can you make it financially or not. And then when the pandemic hit, when places had to close, when expenses went up, when states came in and said, you've got to change how many babies can be in a room, how many teachers for each group of children. So their expenses are through the roof, and lots of parents who couldn't bring their children. So revenues go down. It's just, it was already bad, and then it went to worse. And what the child care operators were predicting, what I've seen here in Massachusetts, it's been worse than that. Places that have not been able to open for months and months, or places that have managed to stay open, but the operation is losing money month after month. They've sold off what they can. So I think of this as we now see the problem. It's raised up in front of us. That means now is the time, not just to provide pandemic relief, although we should do that. Now is the time to think about restructuring overall and getting the kind of support into childcare that our babies need, that our mamas and daddies need, and that our childcare workers need.
That is a great segue to what I wanted to talk to you about next. Last month, we learned that nearly 900,000 women left the workforce. And a huge factor in that was having children at home, both school-age children who would normally be in school or go to aftercare after that's no longer available, and also, young kids who are in preschool and younger. You talked a lot during your own presidential campaign, which I was able to cover. So I have followed Senator Warren around for many months before this. You talked a lot about a universal child care plan. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, and also kind of the gender parity and equity aspect in terms of keeping women in the workforce. And, coming at it from the perspective that we did this as a country in the 1940s. So if we've done it once, could we do it again?
So think of it this way. What do you want to do? What's one of the roles of government? And it is to make us a more prosperous country, right? So how do we do that? Well, one way we do that is we make lots of investments in roads and bridges. Why? So people can get to work, so businesses can move their goods and services. And that's great. That's known as infrastructure. We all make the investment because ultimately it benefits all of us. More people are able to work, they're able to produce more, they pay more in taxes, we make more investments in each other. Great. Childcare should be treated like infrastructure because it is. If we want parents of young children, if we particularly want mamas to be able to finish their educations, to be able to go to work, then all of us, whether we have kids or not, have an interest in investing in childcare for them so that they can do those things, so they can produce in this economy. I mean, it's basically a self-interest. You invest in highways because it makes us a more prosperous country. Invest in childcare. So that's one reason to do it. Let me give you a second one, though. And that is, we need to be blunt about the black-white wealth gap in America. Childcare workers are disproportionately female, right off the top, the group that's paid less than men, but disproportionately Black and brown workers working for the lowest wages in this country. So what we should do is not only invest in childcare, but make enough of an investment that we can raise the wages of childcare workers, that we can have people who have better training, people who make this a real profession and stay in this job for an extended period of time. And again, we do that. We lift a lot of families, particularly women-headed families, families headed by African-American women, by Latinas. We lift them up and they become middle-class families. They have the kind of earnings to support that. So again, these pieces all fit together. Good for the mamas and daddies, good for the babies, and good for the childcare workers. We make investments together, and childcare should be one of those critical investments that we make.
One of the stories that you used to tell on the campaign trail that really stuck with me was your own experience with childcare. Now, you, of course, were also a teacher earlier in your career, but you talked about, raising your two children. Your son was often on the campaign trail with you, doing your tech support, as you often told us. Could you take us back to those days when you were kind of earlier on in your career? You had two little kids. Back then, it was even harder for women to be in the workforce. How did childcare and your ability to get it impact where you were able to go in your own career?
So I still remember I had my first full-time tenure track teaching job down at the University of Houston. I was so excited. And it was tough. It's just like you said, not many women were doing it. I was the second woman hired at the University of Houston. And it meant, late dinners and baths at 8 o'clock and laundry at 10 o'clock and doing my own class preparations at 11 o'clock. All that was hard. I could do hard. The thing that nearly sank me was childcare. We cycled through, I had two little ones, one after another, child care center closed. Babysitter just quit showing up. Neighbor, we're going to pitch in together. Neighbor decides she doesn't like that idea. Now we're back to another child care center, but that one has a long waiting list. You know what this is like? I mean, it was just horrible. So I'm into the spring of my first year, and my Aunt B called one night from Oklahoma City. She's 78 years old. And she said, "How you doing, honey?" And I said, "Fine." And then I just burst into tears. And I said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm going to quit my job." I didn't even know I was going to say it, but I just realized I was failing. I was failing at everything. I was failing my children. I just couldn't hold it together. Now, my Aunt B waited for me to quit crying. And then she said the words that changed my life. She said, "Well, I can't get there tomorrow, but I'll come on Thursday." And she arrived with 7 suitcases and a Pekingese named Buddy and stayed for 16 years. And that's the only way I'm here today, is because of my Aunt B. And here's the thing that gets me. I came within a breath of just losing everything I'd worked for, my education. Those tenure track jobs for women just didn't come along that often. I came that close to losing it. And if it hadn't been for my Aunt B, I would have. But today, women have so many more opportunities in the workplace. They do. But the childcare part of it, I think it's harder than ever. I think it's harder than ever for women to find the childcare arrangements that let them either finish their education or take on a more demanding job, go from part-time to full-time, whatever it is they want to do. And that's the part that really makes me lean back, Amanda. I think of how many women in my generation were just knocked off the rails. And sure, maybe you get back on later, but then again, maybe you don't. How many of my daughter's generation were knocked off the rails, and now, not quite old enough, but how many of my granddaughter's generation get knocked off the rails because of this? This pandemic is being felt disproportionately by the parents of small children, and particularly by mothers, by women. And we just need to acknowledge that straight up and say, we demand change. Enough of this. You want to build a future for this nation, then invest in childcare for our babies.
What would change look like? Because I'm sure what you just described is resonating with so many people watching right now. I mean, I do not have children. Most of my friends do at this point. They are at their wits' end, more than 6 months into this, trying to juggle demanding jobs, keeping their house going, making sure their kids, get dressed, much less Zoom in for their preschool. I have a friend whose child is in his first year of preschool, and he's supposed to be doing it on Zoom. What would change look like? You have a policy for everything. So what would universal pre-K look like? What would universal childcare look like? Would it be something we buy into? Would it be completely financed? And of course, that question that everyone wants to know, how would we pay for it to get it done?
So let's start with non-pandemic, all right? Because like I said, the need is there. Even without the coronavirus, the need is there. Millions of people live in what are called childcare deserts, 0 or 1 childcare centers. People who live even where there are multiple childcare centers see that the lists are long for being able to get a child in, particularly with babies or very small toddlers. So what do we start with? We start with, let's make the arrangement between the federal government, which has the ability to do the taxing and gather the resources, straight down to the community level. So you want to open a child care center? Great. As long as you'll meet the local requirements on safety and little potties and, enough child care workers, and do they have the right kind of credentials, then the federal government will put money into it. You could be a private individual, you could be a church, you could be a community center, you could be a public school. that's got 2 rooms that don't get used as much and you'd like to do that. You could be an employer who'd like to take some extra space at your place and have an on-site childcare center. And then let's start with the presumption it's free, but as incomes go up, well over $100,000, you pay up to 7% of your income. And that's it. Nobody ever pays any more than that. So it's affordable for everyone to be able to do that. We make that investment. And the way I'd like to see it operate is basically you sign your kid up the way you sign your kid up for public school. That is, our obligation is to make sure there's space for your kid, not your obligation to haul around all over the county looking for a place that might be able to take someone who's 18 months old. So that's the basic structure. We build that structure and we make that commitment. Make it to our mamas, make it to our babies, make it to the child care providers and the people who want to come in and be child care providers. We make that commitment. Now, in a pandemic, you need a boost on top of that. You need a boost because the ordinary patterns aren't going to work. We need a boost so that we can keep the babies more separated, a boost so that we can have more workers, a boost so that our essential workers are getting extra pay for taking on the hazards of being out and handling little babies that are kind of germy sometimes, right? Dealing with that. And you ask about how to pay for it. Let me just start by saying we are in a pandemic. This is a healthcare emergency and it is an economic emergency. As a government, what we need to do, this is just Econ 101. We need to be getting that money down into the hands of people so that they can work and keep working. That's how you support demand. That's how you keep the economy running. So right now, quite rightly, no one is saying we have to find pay-fors in order to be able to put the money in a pandemic. For me, long-term sustainable, I support a wealth tax for doing this. A lot of different ways you could do it. But the point is, let's make the commitment. We make the commitment for roads and bridges. I want to make a commitment for our children. Surely they are at least as important as our cars.
And one reason I wanted to talk to you a lot about what we're calling childcare in this conversation is because it's also early childhood education, these critical first years, especially in areas and in populations where they could really benefit from that before they go to school, proper school, starting in first grade or beyond. A lot of parents have written in asking about, is this a time, has the pandemic created a situation where there might be the political will and the policymaking will to rethink how we do some of this stuff and get it done, whether it's universal child care or early childhood education, or even innovation at other levels of education, whether we're talking about, yes, maybe incorporating some remote learning or something like that. Like, do you hear in your conversations on the Hill anything shifting?
So the answer is yes. I think this is the moment. I think the whole conversation around child care and education has reached a new intensity, partly from parents at home saying, oh my God, how much I need this, but also saying, wow, what those teachers have been doing is really hard. And, as they sit with a child on a laptop trying to make the pieces work, understanding the challenges, I think, that we face in the education system. And I'm actually going to take your question and integrate it in both directions.
Perfect.
We call it childcare when it's babies and toddlers. And then someplace in there at 3 years old, 4 years old, we start calling it pre-K. And then kindergarten, first grade, second grade, we call it school or education. It's education all the way across, and it's childcare all the way across. And we should be thinking of it that way from the beginning. And, there are a lot of studies that show that we should be investing more in the education of our littlest ones, whether their parents work or not. This idea of getting 1-year-olds in places where there are lots of new, bright, shiny things and lots of toys and lots of other kids running around. Those are good for kids. Those are good for brain development. And here's the thing, even non-working parents, when they have the resources, even if they don't work outside the home, will often enroll their children in 3 mornings a week of play, 5 mornings a week of play, because they understand this is an important part of their development. Same is true as you move on through the system. Second graders, yes, we invest in their education, but we need to set it up so that there's time before the school classes begin, so there's time afterwards, where there's plenty of enrichment, lots of good things going on, whether it's lots of physical education or free play or however you want to structure it, but so that parents can safely and confidently drop their children off in the morning and then head to work themselves or pick them up a little later than the school day ends in the afternoon or evening, and know that their children are getting a good experience. Again, I think this old way that you break it apart, that there's only school and only childcare, it just doesn't make any sense given what we've come to understand both about how children learn and about the needs of working parents and what it means to try to manage a family and a job. So I want to see a lot more integration of that, and I want to see a lot more innovation. And I think a lot of schools are ready to do that. I think a lot of teachers are ready to do that. A lot of parents are ready.
Unfortunately, we're getting close to the end of our time, so maybe time for one more. I could talk to you all day about this.
Oh, I could talk to you about this all day.
I'm sure they could listen all day. This is consuming so much of everyone's mind space right now. There is this latest skinny bill that we talked about earlier. It sounds like, from your perspective, that wouldn't do nearly enough to kind of get everyone safely back at school and back at their childcare arrangements. What other relief, if anything, is on the horizon for parents in terms of education or childcare? In what time frame could they expect it? We are heading into a winter that is looking like, we are still going to be dealing with this pandemic. We're going to be confined to our homes more than ever before because of the weather. What can they expect? Is it something that would have to happen next year if we get a new Senate or a person in the White House? Kind of what can parents expect over the next few months in terms of whether any more help is on the way?
Well, let's start with what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are saying. Joe Biden has made a central part of his presidential policies what he calls the caring economy, an investment in childcare, an investment in universal pre-K for 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And I should add, also an investment in care for seniors. This is another responsibility that so disproportionately falls on women. And what Joe wants to see is he wants to see us as a nation make those investments. He's got some really big plans around this, and the people around him are working. We're working in the House. I'm working with Senator Patty Murray, who's just been terrific. Childcare has been an issue she has pushed for years, trying to get more support into childcare, and really made it a central part of her mission as the senator from Washington State. So I see this as now clearly identified as a national priority for the Democrats. I'm going to talk politics now for a minute, and that is to say, if Joe Biden gets elected November 3rd, and we get the Republicans lose control of the Senate. Mitch McConnell is no longer in charge in the Senate, and the Democrats take control of the Senate, and we hold on to the House. If that happens, I think we can expect a lot of change. Now, that's, as you know, nobody officially comes in until late in January. But here's one little part that I want to mention even so. The folks in Washington, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they listen. to people around the country. Sometimes I don't think so. Sometimes I get really aggravated with some of my colleagues. But the truth is, they care about what voters care about. I think if voters say pretty strongly on November 3rd, we want to make it a priority to invest in our kids. We want to make it a priority to make the investments in this economy to get us out of this mess that we're in right now. I believe we will be in a better place, even starting right after the election, to be able to push folks in the direction of getting a more comprehensive relief package that it would at least help state and local government, help our child care providers, help put out the money so that schools can reopen. I can't promise anything specific, but what I can promise is I'm fighting for it now. I'm trying to lay as much runway as I can for it right now. And I will be fighting for it after the election. And I definitely will be in this fight so that we get this done immediately after we get a new president and a new Senate in place.
Well, it sounds like everyone needs to be contacting their elected officials in Congress and also making sure to vote, because we at the 19th like to encourage everyone to vote. That's what we're named for. So thank you so much, Senator Warren. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this today. And it was a wonderful conversation, and I hope to see you again soon.
Oh, thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you so much for lifting up this issue. You know, for far too long, this has just been somebody else's problem. The mamas who are trying to deal with it one off. And finally, I think we are starting to say as a group, we've had it. This is no way to run a country, and we are going to demand change. I think that's what November 3rd is going to be all about.
Thank you so much.
See ya.
Bye.
Thank you to Amanda and to Senator Warren for kicking us off with that first conversation. Now we're pleased to present this conversation between the 19th's Editor-in-Chief, Andrea Valdez, and former Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings.
Hi, my name is Andrea Valdez. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the 19th, and I'm here with Margaret Spellings. Secretary Spellings, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be with you, Andrea.
Really excited to have this conversation. So I wanted to start with a question that I think a lot of parents are asking themselves right now. You have talked about keeping students in school right now, and there's a lot of questions. We're looking at the pandemic seems to be a little bit on the upswing right now, and I think there's questions from parents. How safe is it to be keeping our students in school right now? And you've advocated that this is something that we should be really thinking about in keeping students on campus. And I wanted to have you explain a little bit more why you think it's so important.
Well, I don't think that's a categorical statement. I think it really does depend on the situation of the individual student and the teacher and the classroom, the community, the disease prevalence, the health infrastructure, and on and on. But I do think we need to be aware that this is not a zero-sum situation, that there are real consequences when students are out of school. In fact, we've done some analysis and working with TEA that here in Texas, we have about 250,000 students who are lost. Enrollment is down about 6% in Texas, and that's a major concern for policymakers and of course for families. So it depends, but I do think schools and school districts are demonstrating that they can provide safe environments for students and teachers, and we're seeing more and more of that around our state.
That's great. And I'm glad that you clarified that there are some conditions and caveats to what the safety measures should be taken. One of the other things that you've written about actually in an op-ed for the Dallas Morning News, I believe, that I thought was really interesting was talking about testing in schools. And I know that there has been just some questions about, do we continue doing testing right now in a pandemic when everything feels as though it's kind of upside down and school has just changed so much because of the conditions that we're in. And I thought you could talk also a little bit about the testing and why you've talked about the importance of maintaining some testing right now.
Absolutely. I'd like to say we need to care enough to find out how our students are doing. If you have a health condition, when you go to the doctor, they don't just start prescribing things. They find out what your condition is in. And that's still important. Now, I do think one of the hard lessons of COVID is that parents who are now more engaged in many cases with their own students are seeing, rather than get a report card in the backpack, are really having some understanding about how well their students do or do not read, how well their students do or do not work with math, or do not write well, and so on. So I think there's some real benefit there. But testing is a critical part, and always has been, of education, and that is progress monitoring, finding out where our students are and getting them the help they need.
And so, speaking of data and information and collection of information on how our students are doing, right now we're looking at the census that is, we're drawing to a close there. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the census and just the importance of, how that impacts funding for schools and what that means for our communities. And, I know it's something that's been on people's minds as we're looking here through 2020 and the last 10 years and getting a sense of kind of where we are as a country.
Well, Texas is a real microcosm of our country. We're 29 million people or so today. We're growing and will continue to grow another 10 million or so over the next 16 years into our bicentennial. And we are at the same time getting older and younger and more diverse. And so when we look at federal funding for education or for our representation, making sure that every single one of our fellow Texans who will be receiving services are counted accurately and properly so that we can resource our needs appropriately.
Well, can we go back to the diversity piece and just to talk about, students who are, kind of figuring out some of the virtual schooling, things like that. Do you have thoughts on what it means for, there are different strata of students who, might have better access to broadband or the internet or, some of the educational resources they might need right now. And can you talk about just a little bit of, what we should be thinking about with regards to the diversity of our student population and just making sure no one's, falling through the cracks here?
Well, a lot of students are falling through the cracks, and COVID has really laid bare the longstanding inequities in our systems of education. And broadband is but one example. When in mid-March, when we immediately went virtual in our state of 5.7 or so million school children, about 1.6 million students did not have access to broadband learning, either because of devices or because of broadband capacity. And so that is a big number. And those numbers are felt obviously most acutely in our students of color and in our populations that lack the economic resources. In urban areas, affordability of broadband is a huge issue. In our rural communities, just that plain old infrastructure, technological infrastructure is an issue. And when we've looked at the early returns on the data, students who have access to broadband and have facility with that, have parents who are often college educated and home doing their own work, they have not seen much deterioration in their learning. But in our student populations, obviously, that don't have access to those resources, we are seeing really, really troubling retreats, and we need to address those needs and issues immediately, or it will predict a very dark future for our state and for them.
Have you seen any creative solutions to try and provide broadband or provide some of these resources? I mean, I know libraries have been stepping up in a big way. Is there anything out there that you've seen that you think could be a model for how we could, have this access for kids?
Lots of innovation. And in Texas, Mike Morath has used a lot of the CARES Act funding to fill those gaps. Local school districts, urban in particular, have purchased hotspots. They've distributed devices, ebooks, and so forth, and have purchased tons of them. And so they've made real progress in closing some of those gaps, but there's clearly still more to do. You hear the stories of the school buses that are parked in school parking lots, and families congregate in those parking lots with their children in their vehicles, on their devices, and so on. Clearly suboptimal learning, but better than nothing.
So, you did talk a little bit about kind of at the top of this interview about some of the things that we should be keeping in mind, trying to figure out what's best for my family. If you, and I'm sure you've had people ask you, people who have kids who are trying to figure out like, what is best for my family? What are some of the things, you had mentioned a few, caveats or considerations to keep in mind when figuring out what to do with your students or with your kids. What are some of the pieces of advice that you're giving out to people that or that you've been thinking about that have been front of mind for how to re-enter school safely or how to do virtual schooling safely and well? I mean, parents are, especially mothers, they're full-time mothers, their kids want to be with mom, like how is it that parents could be, what questions should they be asking to make the best decisions?
Well, starting with your own health conditions, your students' health conditions, and your family's health conditions. I think those are obviously foundational. Second, asking a lot of questions and learning a lot about what your school district is doing to keep your students safe. Masking, social distancing, plexiglass, no lunches in classrooms, temperature checks, cleaning protocols. And those have become pretty ubiquitous. I think schools have been very, very responsible in that way. And then thirdly, obviously, what are the learning platforms? How well is your student adapting to learning online? Do you have that capability? Do you have that high speed access? Or is your student better situated in an online in-person kind of environment? We're seeing a lot of hybrids where school districts are trying to kind of split the baby. So 1 week they're in school physically, and then the next week they're learning virtually. That's extremely challenging for teachers who are having to do two modalities simultaneously. But I think, as I reflect on it in my own situation, in my own family, if you're willing to go to a movie theater or a restaurant, but stop short of going to school, I kind of question that. I mean, what is your risk tolerance overall? Because if you're going to, extend that risk, doing it in a school, doing it so your child can learn, so you can learn, might be a place to do it.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up teachers. I'm curious to know, what is it that you are hearing, or, what are your thoughts on if there's going to be a loss of teachers right now? I know that a lot of teachers who may have, many years of experience, who maybe have some health conditions that they're, concerned about in teaching during a pandemic. Are you concerned about a loss of a teacher shortage or some loss of experience in the teacher realm of things?
Well, one thing I'm seeing innovative school districts doing is understanding those conditions, those unique conditions of our teachers, and trying to deploy our human capital in different ways than they might otherwise. So, for example, I'm a 62-year-old woman. Let's say I have underlying conditions, but I'm the world's greatest lecturer on political science. And so maybe I should be the one that's beaming out virtually, not going into an in-person environment, so that younger teachers then are working more directly with my students while I'm taking the burden of that lecture and the preparation from that teacher who's doing the more face-to-face sort of model. So it's requiring us to tailor and innovate around individual needs, both for teachers and students.
Yeah, great. Well, so one of the things that I'm curious about, of course, education is an ongoing, lifelong, pursuit, and, our students will be kind of probably dealing with some of the fallout of this particular acute situation that we find ourselves in. What is it that you are concerned about that might be a problem now in the pandemic that will see repercussions or ripple effects down the line? And what are some solutions to some of those issues that you're hoping that we can enact now so that we don't have, some of what could be a really big problem down the line?
Yeah, I hear it everywhere I go, and I have great respect for teachers who are on the front lines of being the shock absorbers for that trauma that students and families are feeling now. It is real. And certainly it can be a growth experience as people adapt if we play that hand well. But those issues are real, and teachers are on the front line and the receivers of those signals right off the bat. So I think we need to make sure that we don't leave out mental health as part of the equation of back to school in a functioning way. that teachers and parents are checking in with each other, either virtually or over the phone, so that there's that direct connection. This is causing teachers to really work triple overtime to keep their sights on not only the learning, but also just the emotional and mental state of their classrooms.
Yeah, and you've written about just the importance of educational systems as an institution. And I thought you could talk a little bit more about that too, and just, what is it that we can and should be doing to safeguard these institutions, both from a community standpoint and maybe from a policy or political standpoint?
Absolutely. And I think, we've all seen and we have maybe taken for granted what the institution of our American public schools really mean to the functioning of our own families, our ability to work outside the home, but also our economy broadly, the opportunities that women have had and have been facilitated by our schools and the various programs, after school programs and the like that go around that. And so it's a real wake-up call for people to respect those institutions. Further, they are places where people come together, whether they're through sports or through the arts or through all manner of activities where schools are the hub, where we learn to respect each other, to respect our differences, to be in conversation about politics or about our kids. And so I think we're seeing the fraying of those connections that are often brought to us by virtue of strong public schools.
So as with all things, we're living in polarized times and everything's a political issue or at least to some people's minds. And that would include education, which is not necessarily new, but I am curious to know from your perspective, are there some bipartisan efforts on the policy level, at the legislative level, that you think are promising and that we could use to kind of underscore the importance of our educational system?
A couple of things really come to mind. First of all, broadband ubiquity is a must. And whether you're an urban legislator who may be a Democrat or a rural legislator who may be a Republican, I think everyone sees the need to make sure that we have that full capacity for all of our students. And it's also critical, of course, for health and for commerce, and not just our schools. So I think we will see some real bipartisanship at the federal and the state level on that issue. Secondly, I'm really bullish on this idea of a tutoring corps, where we know that, we've got to address the potential for learning loss, and we must do so safely. We're going to need assets other than just those overwhelmed teachers who are dealing with 20 or 30 students. So how could we harness our university students, our retired people, volunteers that could work one-on-one with our young would-be readers so that kids can get the help they need in safe ways, and that we can make sure the future of our country is strong because those kids have what they need now.
Oh, that's interesting. I had never heard of the tutoring corps. Is that something, like you said, it would be volunteer? Would it be something where it'd be one-on-one, or that students would sign up for it, or that you'd have kind of feeder,
it's
from
just
like a university to a school?
Yeah, it's just an idea that's really starting to get some traction. I've been talking with my colleagues and predecessors, John King and Arnie Duncan, about it. I know Sal Khan is interested in it. So there's starting to be kind of a little bit of a conversation at the policy level about it. And I think it'll be an interesting conversation and something that we know we're going to have to put some assets against helping our kids get caught up. And we can't rely solely on our teachers to do that.
No, and well, to go to the technology piece of things, you talked about the importance of broadband, which, I agree with. I think that that's something that communities are wanting and needing more and more of. Technology is interesting, right? It's something that has helped us in so many ways and is good for us in so many ways. The same with data. Data is so helpful and it's informative and it illuminates and casts light on issues. But sometimes, technology can lead us astray, or data can show us, things that maybe they look like a problem in the data, but they might not be a problem actually. How do we safeguard ourselves against letting ourselves be too led around by the nose when it comes to technology? I mean, we're seeing that I know that I'm here in an office situation where I'm on Zoom all the time, and it's no substitute for being in person, right? Technology is great. It has really helped bridge the gap, but there's something that we still need about just, person to person contact. Data, sometimes, you think you're making a conclusion, and the conclusion, when you really get down to it, might not actually be what's best for you, your family, your business, whatever. What are some of the things that we should be asking ourselves when it comes to how we use technology and data correctly?
Well, on the technology piece, I think you're right. I think while we need to make sure that we're maximizing these tools and can do so in smarter ways than we have. I mean, we've made more progress in the last 6 months that we made in the last 20 years prior to that in terms of using them and becoming more facile with them. And we can refine that. And how do we think about that when we do have in-person learning? And use that to augment and help students get caught up and maximize our human capital and so on. So I think we're learning as we go, but people realize it is not a silver bullet, that we do want to and need to return to those relationships with our between students and adults. And with respect to the data, one of the things that is our middle name at Texas 2036 is our reliance on accurate, timely, publicly available data that is proffered in ways that policymakers and the public can understand. And so, if you call the TEA or any agency and say, hey, I'd like to have this question answered, they'll send you a PDF of, 75 pages and wish you luck. And so organizations like ours, I think, can take some of the friction out of that and make data and the use of it more practical and more actionable for real folks.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was, we're right now, at least here in Texas, we're in early voting. I think people are looking ahead to the elections. And some of the elections that we're looking at are local elections, of course, state elections, federal elections, and those are all important. But I'm curious, there's going to be state district elections and state board elections. What are some of the things that parents and teachers should be asking themselves as they go into the polls and head into the ballot box, with this on their mind? What questions should they be asking of their, elected officials?
Well, very importantly, last session, our legislature passed House Bill 3, which represented a major reform in our school funding system, and also major investments for early childhood education and for teacher pay and for bilingual education and extended school year, and all of these critically important reforms that were important then and much more so even now. And so I hope that people will be asking their prospective representatives how they feel about education. Look, if you're in the state legislature, most of the budget is, more than half of the budget is spent on public K-12 and higher education. So it's the most important thing that our state does. So pay attention to those issues, of course. At the federal level, we, I think, understand that there's a real need for federal leadership, especially on things like broadband, especially on issues around civil rights. The entire reason for the U.S. Department of Education grew out of the Great Society programs and a focus on equity. And clearly that's a critical matter before our nation and our students as well.
That's great. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. The last thing I want to ask is, and I do want to end on what I hope is a hopeful or positive or optimistic note. I think that there's a lot to be concerned about right now, rightfully so. But I'm curious from your perspective, what makes you optimistic with regards to education going forward, even if we're in a really critically acute, painful moment right now?
We are seeing adaptation and innovation in ways that we haven't witnessed in decades. Necessity is indeed the mother of invention, and we're seeing a lot of that now. And when in the aftermath of that, when this is cataloged and better understood, what has worked, with whom, when, it will really help us leapfrog ahead. And so I'm optimistic about that. There'll be some things that need to be left on the cutting room floor and the old ways of doing business, and some real innovation and personalization and customization, and some things that will really help students improve their learning. And I'm bullish on all of that.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you, Secretary Spellings, for that terrific dialogue. Now I am so thrilled to introduce our first performance of the day, Brandi Carlile and the incredible members of the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles performing The Joke. Wait until you hear this.
Hi, I'm Jackie Rodriguez. I'm 19 years old, I go to UCLA, and I have been a part of YOLA for the past 10 years. I'm so excited to introduce this performance featuring two of my colleagues and close friends in YOLA, Maggie Hernandez and Rachel Hernandez, in concert with Brandi Carlile. It's important to YOLA that we participate in this 19th Represent Summit on education amid a pandemic because it is important to ensure individuals, especially the new generation of young voters, to know the power they hold from both voting and community organizing. We as a generation have proven to advocate for the equality of all individuals and will continue to empower those around us to have their voices heard, both aloud and through their ballots. And now over to Brandi, Maggie, and Rachel.
2, 3, 4. Quiet voice and impeccable style. Don't ever let them steal your joy and your gentle ways to keep them from running wild. They can kick dirt in your face, dress you down and tell you that your place is in the middle. They hate the way you shine. I see you tugging on your shirt, trying to hide inside of it, hide how much it hurts. Let them laugh while they can. Let them spin, let them scatter. Discouraged, don't you, girl? It's your brother's world for a while longer. You gotta dance with the devil on the river to beat the stream. Call it living the dream, call it kicking the ladder. They come to kick dirt in your face, to call you weak, and then displace you after carrying your baby on your back across the desert. I saw your eyes behind your head, and you're looking tired, but you don't look scared. Let them laugh while they can. Let them spin, let them scatter around.
That was absolutely breathtaking. Thank you to Brandy and the Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles for that incredible performance. Next, the 19th State House's reporter Barbara Rodriguez will lead a discussion on how underserved children are being left behind in the at-home era of the COVID-19 pandemic and what we can do about it. Joining the conversation are Dr. Sharon Contreras, the superintendent of Guilford County Schools in North Carolina, Congresswoman Johanna Hayes of Connecticut, the 2015 John F. Kennedy Teacher of the Year and the 2016 Connecticut Teacher of the Year, Luz Chaparro Hernandez, a teacher in Milwaukee Public Schools in Wisconsin, and Susan Hudson, a teacher in the Thornton Township High School District 205 in Illinois.
Hello and welcome to Live with the 19th. My name is Barbara Rodriguez. I'm the State House's reporter for the 19th. I'm incredibly honored to introduce our panel today, Dr. Sharon Contreras, Superintendent of Guilford County Schools in North Carolina, Luz Hernandez, a bilingual elementary teacher for 25 years in Milwaukee Public Schools in Wisconsin, Congresswoman Johanna Hayes, a former teacher who now represents Connecticut's 5th District. She's been recognized as Connecticut's Teacher of the Year and in 2016, the National Teacher of the Year. And Susan Hudson, a special education instructor at Thornwood High School in South Holland, Illinois. Thank you all again for participating in this panel. So this is an extraordinary time in public education, whether that's as a policymaker, an educator, or student, or a parent. The coronavirus has effectively created different worlds in public education, in-person learning and virtual at-home learning, or some variation of that. And so I want to kick things off by just asking, each one of you how you're doing right now in this moment as educators and leaders. And I'll start with you, Susan.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So right now, I think all of my colleagues would agree with me when I say we are really trying to not only just practice self-care, but be there for our students. A lot of our students need to be recognized that they're going through some stress, especially our high school students. They have unprecedented amount of responsibilities that are being put upon them. And we just really need to recognize that they need us and that sometimes it goes beyond the curriculum.
And I'll extend this question to you, Luz, as well.
I also thank you for this opportunity. And I very much agree with Susan that this is a very stressful time. I myself am doing well physically, health-wise, but I am very worried for my students and their families. I serve the most vulnerable families here in the city of Milwaukee. I am a bilingual teacher in an urban school setting. And so the families are struggling financially. And so also technology is a big challenge for them and for my students at times. And so I'm just really worried. That's how I'm doing. I'm very worried for my students and for their families.
Superintendent Contreras, let me turn to you. You lead one of the nation's largest school districts with more than 10,000 employees and 73,000 pre-K through 12 students. What does this moment look like for you right now?
So I just was thinking about leading one of the largest school districts in the country. We have 73,000 students, 10,000 employees, 127 schools. And we've been trying to deal with all of the challenges, many that others shy away from. And there's a reason I said that so many people stay away from the superintendency because there are just so many challenges when there is not a pandemic. And these are challenges that are inherent in our education system. So we've been working to ensure, first and foremost, that we address the issue of the census. We're in the midst of collecting census data in the middle of this pandemic to make sure that our students and their families are counted We want to make sure that every single family has a say and that we don't lose more funding during the pandemic. So we've been mapping and analyzing census data. We also use that data to map the broadband internet connectivity to determine where to place learning centers and internet hubs in our communities and where to more strategically place community locations for meal distribution. We've served more than 2 million meals. We've been outfitting new technology on school buses and deploying them to housing developments, mobile home parks, and other distressed areas to increase internet access for students, while also distributing more than 18,000 laptops and tablets to students. That may sound like a lot, and it is, but remember, we have 73,000 students, so we should have had more. We've been expanding our access to hotspots outside of our buildings. We've ensured that our incarcerated youth in juvenile detention centers and adult jails were not forgotten, fighting to ensure they had access to technology that previously had been banned as a safety risk. So we had to fight for them to have technology. Sadly, we also had to fight to ensure that our students living in homeless shelters and transitional housing had access to technology and instruction, a situation made more challenging by the quarantine and strict isolation rules. And using our value-added data to identify our highest performing teachers, those who consistently help students grow a year or more academically, and then filming those teachers as they delivered high quality lessons online. We then use those lessons during the first 3 weeks of school to give our teachers who are not on contract during the summer months time to better prepare for remote learning. So we use the very best teachers we have to do all of the instruction for the first 3 weeks. We've ordered more than 79,000 tablets and laptops and 3,500 more hotspots to help bridge the digital divide during the pandemic, while also strategically moving toward a one-to-one district. And we've partnered with 65 community groups to feed hungry children in our community, distributing more than 19,000 meals daily for a peak of more than 40,000 meals daily last spring. As I said,
I apologize. I just want to make sure, I actually absolutely want to talk a little bit more about the digital divide a bit. I want to make sure that we get to some of the other issues, and some of that's going to be some of the very answers that you just gave. I want to make sure I ask Congresswoman, you are a former teacher. I understand that you have plans to return to the classroom at some point in the future. I'm curious how the conversation of virtual learning is playing out in the halls of Congress, still sort of being mindful of the general question of just how you're doing as a leader right now.
Well, I always refer to myself as not a former teacher, but an educator serving in Congress, because I don't know what a former teacher is. It's wired into my DNA. As far as how I'm doing, I think I share what we heard Lou say at the very beginning, just a sense of concern. I'm concerned about my former students. I'm concerned about my former colleagues. I actually just recovered from COVID. My husband and I both tested positive for COVID. I have a middle school age son who is at home virtually. And while people think, well, your mom's a teacher, this is a no-brainer. It is so incredibly difficult for me to continue my work as a congresswoman and now be my son's teacher. So I can't imagine someone who is not professionally trained to do this, what they're experiencing. It weighs so heavily on me because I understand completely the depth of what schools will need to get back to normal. This is a temporary normal right now. So I am trying to help my colleagues understand that while in their mind they're thinking of legislation in a hypothetical way, I'm trying to connect the students and the faces and the educators on the other side of this legislation and help them to truly understand what that means. I spent 15 years in a Title I district, so I know that it's not just about being healthy, it's about closing all of those gaps that the superintendent just talked about. And there's a tremendous burden that comes with that because you feel responsible for the people who are standing in front of kids trying to help them feel safe.
One of my central questions in this whole conversation is, again, who is getting left behind with at-home learning and why? And I'll pose that question to one of our teachers, Luz, just because I feel like everyone's going to have a different response to this, but I'm very particularly interested in hearing what teachers on the ground are experiencing right now.
Well, I think who is getting left behind really are those, first and foremost, those students that were already behind before the pandemic hit. So now that the pandemic hit, I think it's just, accumulated to the burden that they have to bear in terms of, what they have to learn and how quickly they have to learn it. And now this newer way of learning, even though, as an educator, I of course implemented technology into my teaching as a resource. It was not used as the main mode of, transmitting the educational experience. And so now that in itself, I think, is also very much a burden for our students. And I know that Ms. Susan Hudson is a special education educator, but I am also very concerned about the special education students that I service, that my school services, that my district services, because I think that they are really getting left behind. In an urban district such as Milwaukee Public Schools, a lot of the parents don't have the resources. I'm not saying all, but a lot of the parents don't have the resources to, for example, hire a private tutor, which more affluent parents do. If they happen to be parents of a special needs child, they have the resources to do that. And I know that for a fact. And so I really, really am concerned about special education students and then just students that were already behind academically before the pandemic hit.
Susan, I saw you nodding your head a lot. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this.
I completely agree with Luz. Our most vulnerable students are definitely from underserved communities are definitely being left behind because they don't have the structure and support at home and the adequate technology. It's great that we made ourselves a one-to-one district and provided Chromebooks and a hotspot, but if there's many people at home using the internet, you might need more than one hotspot because the connectivity issues. People need to understand that working independently is hard and that our students were dropped into a whole new realm of learning and they need time to acclimate to this new way of learning, as do educators to teaching students. This thing that people say new normal, this ain't normal. It's a pandemic. Nobody experienced it prior to 2020. So we're all trying to learn together and we have to be patient with it.
I think this is a segue into...
Barbara, can I just add to what Susan just said? Because I'm so happy that you included educators. I mean, first of all, when you talk about technology, I know that for my son, even though we had a computer in the house, he's asked to print things, to scan things, to send them back to the teacher. There's a lot of times where I have to assist him to do that. But there's also, students aren't the only ones who are affected. And it shouldn't be an us or them. There are so many educators who were told at the beginning of the week, you are going to transfer the delivery of all of your instruction to virtual or online. Teaching is a profession. Those are skills that are learned, that are practiced, that acquire time to acclimate to them. So this idea that you could do the same as a classroom teacher, my secret weapon was relationship building, was getting kids to trust me, to talking to them. That requires a different skill set when you're doing it virtually. So we have to, as Dr. Contreras said, provide opportunities for professional development for teachers, for them to understand and learn the platforms. And for many people who had never done this before, just giving a student a computer is not enough.
I want to make sure that I can highlight a little bit more about this conversation over the technology gap. There's been reports of school districts having difficulty obtaining enough laptops for their students being unable to access Wi-Fi. I think logistically, or from a logistics standpoint, I want to better understand how educators and students are managing, and I want to pose that question to Superintendent Contreras.
Yes, it's been very difficult because of a lack of adequate educational funding We depend on our county for our state and county for funding. We're not allowed to have a lease to own program or engage in a lease to own program without our county allowing us to do so. And they denied that even in the midst of a pandemic. So we had to scramble for every dollar we could find, cut off all spending, just so we could purchase 79,000 devices. And the county didn't tell us they were going to deny our request for until I think about May. We made the request at the end of March. And so we scrambled to put together all of the end of year funds to place the order, only to find that there's a global backlog. And so our students, even after having money to purchase the Chromebooks, we still don't have the Chromebooks in the district yet. And so our community has been coming together. We had to do a drive for gently used technology devices, laptops, Chromebooks, and our technology department, wiped them clean so that we could loan them to students. But this is not fair. This is not right in the United States of America, that there are entire school districts where students don't have access to technology, students don't have access to high-speed connectivity. And as educators, we've been talking about this homework gap for a long time. And there are government bodies that we depend on that can just say to us, no, we're not going to get that for you. We're not going to address this issue. And the parents don't understand all of these nuances of how government works. So they're angry at the very people, the teachers, the principals, the school boards, the superintendents, who are the ones who are fighting for their children, because that's who they see. And those are the people that can't turn around and deliver the laptop, can't deliver the hotspot. And so it's been a really difficult position to be in. And it's heartbreaking to know you're losing students, to know there are children in homes that just are not getting an education and you can't even locate them. And this should not be the situation we're in the United States of America in 2020.
I want to make sure that I can also highlight that it's not just the conversation over technology. I think educators are thinking as well about the dynamics of mental health for students. I'm curious, Susan, what you're thinking about when it comes to those dynamics versus just even technology.
Sure. Well, we have to recognize that, it's almost like the Congresswoman said, people have to realize that students are at home and they're missing that connection with the instructor. So it's the relationship building. It's I don't have the teacher over my shoulder to tell me if that's right or if that's wrong. So they are dealing with an unsurmountable amount of stress. And then when I speak about my high school students, I know kids who they come to they come to learning on the computer, and then they have to go to work because they now have the responsibility to help provide for the home if a parent lost their job due to the pandemic. So there are some rather who also have to take care of siblings while their parent might be going to work. So we have to think about the simple fact that we are in a pandemic. That we don't know what our children are seeing on television and the climate they have in their homes. And so that added adverse childhood experience that they're going to is something that districts and community members need to think about when they start saying, oh, my student needs to be in the classroom. Yeah, maybe that's true. I would like to be in the classroom too, but I want to be safe when I go into the classroom because I know in my classroom I have no windows, right? So if I were to go back in the building, I want to be safe because my husband has a compromised immune system and I don't want to bring that back home. I don't want to bring that to my grandmother when I go watch her and visit her because she's 90 years old. So people need to think about the stress that kids are going through and what's around them in their home. That's something we have no control over.
I think I just want to add to that, because all of my experiences frame my decision making. And now, as a legislator in Congress, I see all of the opportunities in what is happening. This is probably has been the most difficult time for me in my first term in Congress. But I think it could not be more critically important that I am where I am right now. Because as I said, I can walk this through from beginning to end. And many of the things that we're talking about in the framework of COVID-19 in this pandemic are things that I already knew about in the classroom. Mm-hmm. The fact that we could not close schools in March without having a conversation about how we're going to feed children, that is a food security issue, not a school issue. But that's something that I was buying snacks for 10 years in the classroom to make sure kids ate. The fact that we can't reopen the economy without reopening schools because parents have to go to work, that's a childcare issue. Again, not a school-based factor. But these are all of the things that we're talking about. As the superintendent said, it's not just about buying technology. We have to now increase the number of IT personnel. People are talking about how kids are negatively impacted. So we need to have a conversation about making sure that we invest in trauma-informed counselors to meet them when they come back from what is probably the most traumatic experience of their life. And again, this year when Congress considered an infrastructure bill, we had to take a step back and be reminded that infrastructure is not just road, bridges, and highways. Our infrastructure package has to include broadband connectivity and internet technology so that our children would be connected at school and in the home. So there's a part of me that, while this is probably a worst case scenario, I am happy that we are having a national conversation about all of the things that I've been screaming for help for the profession that I love and the students that I dedicated and invested my life in. Now everybody is noticing it and talking about it. And I think we have a heightened sense of responsibility to not go back to where we were in February, but to begin to address these systemic inequities, because we know the kids who are the most affected by them.
I want to make sure that I ask a kind of a general question, and I'll offer it up to any of you, whether it's just, is it safe to return to in-person learning, or is that a really complicated question? I'm curious if any one person feels particularly strongly about what that answer is.
Well, if I may speak to that first. I think right now, given that, at least I'm going to speak from my perspective, which is I am teaching in the city of Milwaukee. Right now, the state of Wisconsin is the new hotspot for this virus, okay? And so for me, I very much appreciate my union, the Milwaukee Teachers Education Association, who, 2 months before school started, worked with administration, with our superintendent, Dr. Keith Posley, to ensure that we would start the school year off virtually. Because again, like Susan said, we can't come back and teach and feel safe. The teachers and of course the students and their families. And so I think it is, what is important is a continuity of learning. Okay, and I know that there's some school districts here in the state of Wisconsin, in Kenosha, for example, okay? The teachers there started off in person, started off hybrid, and had to go back to all virtual. Okay, where is the continuity in learning there? It is not happening. Okay, and that is because, and I very much understand that the parents, need their children to come to school, but they also need them to stay safe. And we, the educators, need to stay safe. So I think that for now, given the reality of the pandemic, the safest thing to do is to do all virtual learning.
I'm curious to ask Superintendent Contreras about this, just because I know that in her school district, there are plans in place for in-person learning and a mix of virtual, and I'm just sort of curious what that experience has showed about this conversation.
It's a very complicated situation, and it's the very thing that keeps me up at night, trying to make the best decision possible. What worries me is that half of the districts that serve primarily white students are reopened and serving students. Only a quarter of districts that serve primarily Black and brown students are open. It's worse in the South from the data I'm reading. So the very students that have for centuries been denied education still are not going to school. They begin school behind their peers, their white peers, when there's not a pandemic. There is a tremendous amount of data about the potential learning loss in reading, in math, and what the lifelong repercussions of that is. So I try to think about how can we begin to think about reentry, even if we can't do it all at once. We just can't wait for there to be 0 COVID cases. That's not realistic. And the children who will suffer the most from that sort of expectation are the children who look like us. So we've been trying to bring back pre-K and K, and we're now starting to bring back first, second, and third grade. We have very vulnerable students who are living in shelters, homeless students. We have 3,000 homeless students. Those students, as you know, are most vulnerable to human trafficking, sex trafficking. We have many students who are just at risk of dropping out. Almost all of them are poor, Black and brown. I can't say it's okay for us not to come back when we've spent millions of dollars putting safety protocols in place. So I think we have to start some sort of gradual reentry for the most vulnerable students, for the youngest students, so that their parents can work and not devolve into more abject poverty, and that their achievement gap is not widening. So while I have very serious concerns, I think I have to balance that with the concerns of what the life outcomes will be for these children of color, these poor children, if they're not in school.
I just want to add one final thought to that, because I too share all of your concerns. And one of the things that we've been talking about in committee and that I have brought up is to try to use some of the, maybe next summer, invest in summer school, after school resource programs, instead of having kids go out for breaks, to close the gap of, that summer slide or some of the lost time this year. Because as we have all said before, opening schools where kids and teachers don't feel safe is just geography. Kids are not going to learn if they're there and they're concerned every day that someone's there, someone's not there, that someone at home is sick. So just forward thinking, I have shared with my committee that I think if we have a vaccine this time next year and people are safe and communities are getting up and running and back to normal, maybe we can then add in the supports to close some of the gaps that are lost right now. But to just put people back in a situation so that everything else can return to normal, I think is unfair to kids and to adults.
I'm sort of curious in this point with Superintendent Contreras talking about a decision that sounds local in some ways, and obviously the Congresswoman talking about something that she'd like to see maybe advance through Congress. Is the conversation about reopening schools a local issue, a state issue, a federal issue, some very specific combination? I pose that question to all. I'm curious if any one person feels particularly strongly about that.
Well, I'll be quick because it starts at the federal level, and there are lots of people who think that the federal government should not be involved in local education decisions. And there's a lot that should happen locally, but the federal government absolutely should be making the investments to support state and local governments so that communities, especially communities who are operating off of their tax base, which again puts some of our most disadvantaged students in a worse position, they should not be left to now worry about how they're going to get personal protective equipment or, internet or computer equipment, hire more teachers, have them perform more of these services. That is absolutely a place where the federal government should step in, just like we stepped in to support businesses and other parts of the economy to stabilize them until they can stand again. We should be providing the same level of support for our students and the teachers and educators, bus drivers, cafeteria staff that serve them every day.
I would say that superintendents and school boards are not qualified to set the metrics by which school districts should determine if students should return. There are superintendent school board members who are receiving death threats over this. These should have been determined at either the state level or federal level, and each district would probably return at a different pace or different dates, but based on the same metrics. Now what we have is you could be right next to a district and have a completely different criteria for re-entry, and the parents simply don't understand this. And it has been terrible for us. Every time I have to get up in front of the board and try to explain this stuff, I say to them, I am a doctor, but I'm a PhD, not an MD. And I'm doing my best, but I should not be in this position. And you should feel uncomfortable too. And we should demand that those in positions of leadership, our governors, those at the federal level, come up with a criteria for us, because it's just not fair to our constituents, to those across the state, that every school district is making this up as we go, and depending on the quality of your Department of Public Health instead of the Department of Health and Human Services at the state level or at the federal level. And they're all tiptoeing around this because of politics, and we're in the midst of an election, instead of just making the right decision and coming up with a good criteria. And it's a terrible situation for every school board and superintendent in this nation.
I want to make sure I ask a little bit about what else apart from in-person schooling would help students who aren't doing well with virtual learning. Are we thinking enough outside of the box? Are there models of success that stand out for any one person?
I don't think anyone can really answer that question, because again, we've not seen this before, right? So remote learning is going to look different across the nation because everyone rolled it out a little bit differently. Every school district and home structure is going to look different. I've seen students who complete class in various areas of their home. Not every child has the luxury of sitting at a desk with an ergonomic chair in a quiet room. The reality is that students of all ages, not only are they stressed out, but they are dealing with something unprecedented. So I don't really honestly think anyone can truly answer that question, because we just don't have the answers.
I want to make sure I also ask all of you this question, making sure that I understand, whether you have a call to action for the audience about what you think should come next. And we can start with Superintendent Contreras.
Yeah, so, I'm going to say what I always say, and that is, it is so important that we vote, and that we not vote just based on what people say, but vote on the record and really take some time to make sure that we understand whether or not the individual that you are voting for actually supports public education, making sure they support high-speed internet connectivity for all Americans, and that they support making sure that we get this pandemic under control, and that they can speak to you about how we're going to get this under control, so that the greatest burden does not fall on school districts, in this country, but that we all work on this together, and that we can get students back in school, get teachers back in school as quickly as possible in a safe way. But please, whatever you do, vote.
Luce, I'm curious, a call to action for the audience.
You know what? That is exactly what I have written on my notes as I was preparing for this panel discussion. What Dr. Contreras just said, vote. Vote at the local level in terms of your school board, at the city level. Here in Milwaukee, we have aldermen, and of course the mayor, and at the state level. Here in Wisconsin, we have a Republican state legislature that has really put up roadblocks for what the Democratic governor has tried to do in terms of the pandemic. So then you have to really think, who am I aligned with? And again, as Dr. Contreras said, really, if you have a child in a public school, in public education, then who best supports those ideals? Okay, which candidates? And so, yes, very much vote.
Susan, I'm curious for you, what message you have for everyone.
My call to action is the same as the ladies. We need to make sure that the people who are elected to office, all offices, are well vetted and aligned with our best interests and support public education, period.
And Congresswoman?
Well, as the elected official on this panel, I say I'm Johanna Hayes and I approve this message. But a couple other things, because that is so important, but Dr. Contreras talked about it at the top of the panel. The census is so incredibly important. In Congress, we appropriate billions of dollars in funds. So to make sure that the resources that a community needs are allocated to that community and that we can plan ahead. Ms. Hernandez, when she first came on and you introduced her as a bilingual educator, I remember in my district, we had a year where we had to open up 13 new bilingual classes because no one had prepared for all of these students aging out of elementary school and going into middle school. The census helps us to do things like that. And obviously vote. It is now probably more important. You hear this all the time. This is the most important election of your lifetime. But this is the most important election of your lifetime. But I'll add to the voting piece because it's not just about voting. This idea that you elect a leader and then you send them to do the work and solve all the problems and fix everything, that's really not how it works. We have to hold leaders accountable to make sure that after they get the position that they're doing what they said that they would do. Mm-hmm. In my previous life, in my current life, I would say stay involved. In my previous life, I would have said, listen, stay woke. Parents need to be woke. Educators need to be woke. Everybody needs to be involved because every day in Congress, for all of my teacher friends who say, I don't get involved in politics, let me help you understand that every day I take a vote, I make a decision that impacts your future, that impacts your healthcare, that impacts your retirement. So whether or not you are involved in the conversation, it's happening without you. So voting is not enough. You don't vote and then go home and lock your door and pull your shades back down and retreat into your corner. You vote and you stay woke and stay engaged.
I want to ask another question. With the upcoming winter months, I'm curious about how that plays a role in the conversation about what to do next. And I'll pose that question to Susan and Luce, given that you both live in states that get pretty cold in the wintertime.
As far as the winter months go, I think that the winter months are going to be very challenging as far as COVID, from what I have heard. The winter months are going to pretty much have the virus get worse. I guess the one good thing is that everybody is going to stay inside, but then again, that could be bad because then, we're not out in, out in getting fresh air as much as we are right now in the summer and in the fall. But I think it's just, in terms of, I've stated before that I really, as much as I really sympathize with the parents and, I am here for the parents that I work with, I have been here from even before day one. Since the summer, I was calling my parents to make sure that they were ready to start, virtual learning with their students, in which I found they weren't. So many a night I spent, at home at night with them trying to figure out this whole technology piece. But I really worry again that during those winter months, the mental health of the families is really going to be impacted even more, those long winter dark days. And so one thing that I've tried to do here with my class, even though it's hard to build relationships, online, I teach third grade. And so the first few weeks of school were just getting to know my students. And of course I did do some academics, but that, I really needed to get to know them. And so we played a lot of games and I would put on, and I still do, I put on some videos and we dance and just, build those relationships. And one thing that I've done and that a couple of the teachers in my building have also done is for the time being, I am still being allowed, I set aside one day a week where I meet with the parents outside. And so in the winter, they're just gonna have to come in a little bit, I guess. I'm gonna see how that works out. And they come and they pick up work packets for their students. And I've also taken advantage of handing out important information in the community, resources that are available to them, where, if I sent it out in an email or sent it out on the Remind app, which I use to communicate with them, they might not really grasp what I'm trying to communicate to them. But if I hand them a flyer that's in Spanish, okay, about, I just handed one out for food distribution that a local community organization is doing. So, during the winter months, I think I'm going to need to do more of that because I think, the days are getting longer and drearier. And so they really need to feel like they have somebody in their corner. And at least for my students, I get 100% attendance. I've been doing it since the first week of school when I started September 1st. That first week I did the first parent pickup, and it's been a lifesaver in terms of connecting with my parents. And of course we adhere, everybody wears their mask, and I've gotten to meet my students, okay? I get to see them for about a minute, but it's that connection to see them in person, socially distanced. They hand me their work. I just ask them, how are you doing? How are you feeling? It's nice to see you. And so that's been a lifesaver, and I hope to continue that during the winter months.
And unfortunately, on that point, we've run out of time. I intended to ask that question as well to Susan, but I just want to take a minute to thank all of you for taking this time today to participate in our panel. And thank you all again so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to our incredible panelists for that conversation. If you're watching at home and your little ones are nearby, now's the time to get them to tune in. Next up, we are honored to bring you Academy Award-winning actress Natalie Portman, who will be reading a selected excerpt from her newly released children's book, Natalie Portman's Fables.
Hi, I'm Natalie Portman, and I am so pleased to support the 19th and its efforts to get women more deeply engaged in our democracy. And I'm grateful for all the educators and parents going the extra mile in this difficult time to ensure underprivileged kids don't get left further behind in this pandemic. I wrote my new children's book, Natalie Portman's Fables, because I wanted to have books that both my kids could read that would inspire them to have empathy for all people. I noticed when I was reading books to my son, who's now 9, and my daughter, who is now 3.5, that so many of the characters in the classic books are male, more than you would find in the real world. And so I thought, what if you just took these classic stories, but made them actually reflect the real gender dynamics in the world, and let kids experience these classic stories through a lens that is more reflective of how we actually live. And so I retold The Tortoise and the Hare, The Three Little Pigs, and The Country Mouse and the City Mouse with these different gender dynamics, but really with the classic stories that we loved and enjoyed, and the values that we've passed down from generation to generation. So now, for all the parents and the teachers tuning in, first of all, thank you so much for what you're doing. I mean, these past months have been so incredibly challenging for all of us in different ways. And I've been so inspired and moved by the resilience and flexibility and creativity and positivity that so many teachers and parents have shown. And I know I've learned so much from watching how other people are doing it. And now, if you don't mind turning your screens over to your little ones, I will read you The Three Little Pigs from Natalie Portman's Fables. Three Little Pigs. Illustrations by Jenna Mattia. When Mommy Pig saw that her kids were all grown, she told them it's time to move out on your own. So Norman, Melinda, and Georgie said byes and left their dear mamas to build their own sties. Norm took his couch and got takeout to eat. He slouched on the sofa and put up his feet. He ate noodles and noodles until he was sick, and then his house rose from old dirty chopsticks. You smell worse than me in your house made of junk, said Stinkmaster General, Norm's new squatter skunk. Do you think that chopsticks will prove to be sturdy? I bet that they won't make it past 7:30. Norm sat there surrounded by cartons and boxes, but oops, food attracts hungry wolves and sly foxes. Little pig, let me come in, said Wolf as she ate out of Norm's garbage bin. Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin, said Norm with his voice sounding terribly thin. But Wolf was not there to be scary or mean. She just came to say even pigs should keep clean. Then before Norm could even begin, Wolf huffed and she puffed and she blew his house in. Norm left for his sister Melinda's new digs. He hoped she had room for 2 couch-loving pigs. Melinda loved sodas and all types of sugars. She'd sip as she'd pick and then flick all her boogers. As she just sat there without even knowing, the pile of plastic kept growing and growing. Chimp was her nosy and noisy new neighbor. She said, "Dear Melinda, you must learn to labor. A house built of straws while your thinking is hazy. To have strong foundations, you cannot be lazy." But before she could answer, Wolf knocked at her door. Melinda was shaking. Her head was a roar. Little pig, let me come in. Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. Wolf had no pity. She wore a big grin. She huffed and she puffed and she blew her house in. Now Norm and Melinda walked hoof after hoof to ask to sleep under their third sibling's roof. Young Georgie was never a pig to sit still and preferred to perfect pioneering pig skills. Georgie used clay to frame windows and doors, and stone for the walls and bamboo for the floors. Even though Georgie would make perfect bacon, Wolf was impressed by the house they were making. Little pig, let me come in. Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin. I just want to tell you, I like how you build. You're thoughtful, hardworking, and wildly skilled. But Georgie had heard the 2 other pig stories and knew not to trust in Wolf's shower of glories. Let's meet at Sheep's Orchard at 8:15. We'll pick some red apples. Make sure you're not late. But when Wolf arrived the next morning on time, Georgie was already home making pie. Oh, I got there at 6. You can ask Mr. Rooster. Waking up early is an energy booster. Then let's go tomorrow to Doe's new vines. We'll pick some tomatoes. You'll show your designs. But when Wolf arrived to pick the red fruit, Georgie was already home making soup. Georgie said, "Wolf, won't you get off my lawn? I woke up and picked my tomatoes at dawn. Come down the chimney and join us to eat. We'll have some hot soup and then something sweet." Wolf scooted down into boiling hot water and screamed as the water got hotter and hotter. Wolf climbed out quickly. Now I must confess, I know there's one pig with whom I should not mess. Waking up early and working much harder makes a pig stronger and safer and smarter. Planning and thinking out how to build cleanly makes your house sturdy and keeps earth looking greenly. That is The Three Little Pigs from Natalie Portman's Fables, my new book, which is for sale everywhere that sells books now. And I am so grateful to be part of the 19th event today.
Thank you, Natalie. That was absolutely delightful. And next up is Chabeli Carazana, the 19th's economy reporter, who will lead our discussion on teachers on the front line. She'll discuss how educators and administrators are risking their physical and mental health to keep kids on course. She'll be joined by Dr. Ryan Daniel, an elementary school principal in Prince George's County Public Schools in Maryland, Tanya Sudam, a high school principal at the Baba Cuvare Secondary Campus, Lonnie Watson, a high school counselor in Chadron Public Schools in Nebraska, and Randy Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I am Chabeli Carazana. I am the 19th economy reporter, and I will be moderating this wonderful panel with educators, administrators, and advocates. Thank you all so much for being with us. I wanted to start with a really quick status check. I'd love for each of you to quickly tell me where in the school reopening process you are, how you've navigated those first few weeks, and also for your folks as well, Randy. So, and also most of all, how are you doing? Let's start with the principals. Ryan, you want to go first?
Hello, everyone. So my name is Dr. Ryan Daniel. I am a principal in the state of Maryland, and we are fully virtual. We are fully virtual until the end of January. So we open the building for the first time in distance learning. So we have been just navigating through the virtual learning world, using some of the lessons that we learned at the end of last school year and, making adjustments and just kind of being flexible and rocking and rolling through it. We are almost finished the first quarter, so we are midway through.
What about you, Tanya? I know you all are opening also virtual, but there's some students are back at school.
Good morning. My name is Tanya Sudam. I am from the Thon Nation. I currently serve as the principal of Baba Cuvare Secondary Campus, and we are 100% virtual through the first semester. But virtual means online and packets. And in addition, we do have to have kids on campus for those that need it. So I have about 12 students that are on campus.
And all your students are back in campus already, right, Lonnie?
Yeah, I'm here in my office at school. I can peek through the windows and see my kiddos out in the commons and walking to and from class. I'm the high school counselor in Chadron, Nebraska, a really small town in the panhandle of Northwest Nebraska, very close to South Dakota, Wyoming. And since mid-August, the 16th, we have been back. We had about 10% of our kiddos opted to stay home in an enriched online learning program that we offered this year. But yeah, 90% of our kids are back. We are masked up at our school for the most part, and we are back to learning in person.
Great. And Randy, you want to tell me about your teachers? I know that's sort of a wide swath there, but you all represent some 1.7 million members nationwide. How are teachers coping with these first few weeks back?
So I would say that 70% of the largest districts are basically virtual. And so let's put that bucket aside for a second, because I'm sure we'll get to that. We represent most of the big places and a whole bunch of the medium size, and then a bunch of rural places. So the places where let's say the governors have been really serious about taking on COVID, those places have gone better than the places that have not. And I'm so glad Lonnie said that people are masked up. So like in the places, none of the places we represent have gone full-time in person. Every place that we represent is either hybrid or is virtual. And for the places that are hybrid, there's been a lot of starts and stops where some of the districts have figured out how to fund, even though they don't have the money, the kind of protocols that are needed, like masks and cleaning and physical distancing and ventilation and reasonable accommodation and things like that, and hand washing. And then in some places, even when they've gotten to agreements, there's not a lot of trust. So like in Massachusetts right now, Boston had one of the best agreements there was, but then the COVID rate got up to 4.1%. And they said that if it was at 4, they would close the schools again. So there's been a lot of sturm and drum. New York City has a great reopening agreement. It costs a lot of money. One of the Washington Post reporters, the education reporter, in a tweet last week said, I can't believe we're still having a conversation about money. School reopening in COVID is really expensive. And so New York has some hotspots. As a result, there's about 50% of the kids that are back in person, but the 100 schools that are in the hotspots are now on virtual again until the middle of October. And I say these things because the real issue that's going on is, number one, how do you have safeguards and safety that the scientists tell us, and how do you make sure that they are funded and resourced? Number two, how do you handle whether a child or a teacher or 2 or 3 have COVID? How do you handle that opening and closing on a school by school basis? And then number 3, how do you handle a situation when either a zip code or, or a school district is in a real hotspot and that you end up closing for 2 or 3 weeks? All of those issues are playing itself out. And I would say people really, 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 really want to be back in school. We've done 2 polls that have shown 79% of our members have said that if the safeguards are there, they want to be back in school. 71% of parents have said that to us too. We did this polling with parent groups. But everybody really, really, really wants to be safe. And they want to know a consistent set of safeguards that they can rely on and that is enforceable.
So I'm glad you bring that up, because I really wanted to talk about the in-person aspect of this and what that's looked like now that we are several weeks in, right? In some cases, safety was an enormous concern going into the start of the school year for parents and students, but also for educators, right? What that looks like for the folks who have to be with these large groups of students. So I would really love to hear about, for the folks that are back in person, what kind of precautions you did take. Are there others that you're now adding as you go through this process and that are improving the day-to-day process? And how are the students dealing with these regulations? Lonnie, I want to start with you. I know you had a bit of a challenging start to the school year.
We joke that gold is forged in fire, and we had our fire the first 2 weeks of the school year for certain. And I think being in person, this is going to come in waves for us. And our first major wave of COVID came the first week of school. And we took extra time as a teacher group, as professionals, to go through the protocols, to go through the cleaning. We had our public health came to us, worked with us. We've partnered really closely. We're in a very rural, conservative part of the nation, but our district was committed to partner with them, and not all districts in our state are. So we were following guidelines. We had everything set up. And the very first week of school, the second day of school, both administrators and both high school secretaries in the building I work with were diagnosed with COVID. And so school counselor comes in, and I got to learn all about answering all the phones and being a principal and stepping up for those 2 weeks. But it was terrifying, to be honest, for the staff and for the students. It made everyone take it far more seriously. We already had anxieties about starting school, and adding that the whole high school office was shut down. a lot of phone calls I got personally that our kids seemed to manage very well. They were very still in the excitement of seeing their teachers and seeing each other. So they seemed to manage very well for the most part. As the counselor in the building who kind of gauges that, our parents really struggled. And they struggled on both gamuts. I took a lot of phone calls saying, please stay safe. We need you to run this school. We need to be back in session. A lot of our essential workers in the community were scared because of the way we started school that immediately we were going to go virtual. And we didn't know. It was a day-by-day decision, working closely with our public health to see if we could continue. Luckily, it did not spread through the school. This actually was spread from an event that some individuals were at before school started. It was traced down to that. And luckily, through our precautions and protocols, that it did not spread through the school in that instance, and it stayed with those staff members. But it was definitely an interesting way to start school. We were thrown into the fire, and the anxieties then came out, especially from the parents and the teaching staff for certain.
And Randy, that's been a big concern for teachers as well this year. I know we wrote a story earlier in the year about teachers who were afraid to return to school, wanted to end their contracts starting at the beginning of the year because they did not feel like their school was taking necessary precautions.
Right.
You mentioned the issue that is still lingering with budgeting. Where do you see us going, and where do you see those really priorities that are still remaining to be addressed for teachers across the country who are really, really worried about safety moving forward and sort of this wave of potential cases that is ahead?
So let me just, I'll say two things really quickly, because, you know, I spend basically every waking hour doing two things right now. We're on a bus tour, getting out the vote in 30 different states. So I spend a lot of time on that, but every other piece of my waking hour is spending time on reopening in various different districts. Number one, back of the envelope, it actually will cost 25% more to reopen schools, both remotely and in person, in this pandemic. And we're basically, because of the recessions and the contraction of resources in states, we basically have 25% less. So 90% of educators are actually paying for their own PPE. And I'm so glad to hear Lonnie talk about how in her district, people are really focused with the public health people and things like that. That's number one. And there's lots of resource questions, and they will get more and more acute as the year goes on, because a lot of school districts front-loaded resources. Number two, one piece none of us have talked about yet, is testing. It is like we're on this bus. I test at least twice a week. I have never been so excited to see a negative test. But, you know, every time I see that, you know, but a test tells you where you are that moment in time. So that Los Angeles, New York, Boston, they're all creating strategies that you have a baseline test, and that those kids and teachers who are in schools, there is randomized mandatory testing so that you make sure that you're constantly looking at what's going on in terms of COVID in a school and COVID in a community. And it's not a protection. A mask is a protection. Testing is a diagnostic to actually know some data. So testing becomes a really important feature if we are in this moment of COVID increases. But even if we don't have a vaccine, say for several months, how do you actually figure out what's going on in a community, in a zip code, if you don't have the data? So the testing becomes very, very important, and it's very, very expensive.
Absolutely. And I really want to keep talking about safety. I think that's gonna be a through line of this conversation. The other aspect to it as well, something you touched on a little bit there, Randy, is the economic impact and how hurt a lot of folks have been this year. I know I have a few working mothers that are here on this panel with me, and I really wanted to talk about that impossible juggling act, because that's something we've written quite a bit about. The pandemic has really upended the lives of working mothers. Last month, more women left the labor force than the total number of jobs that were added, some 865,000 workers. Some of that job loss has been in the education sector. And one of the reasons for that has been the childcare aspect and the challenges with childcare. So I wanted to see if you all could talk to me a little bit about that added strain of managing your own children's learning or childcare needs, while also managing the needs of students as well. Tanya, I know you recently had to make a difficult decision on this point. Do you want to start?
Sure. Going 100% virtual, you understand as a parent why. And looking out not only for their kids, but for all of our staff members and our community members. But having to bring them here to my office and to try to lead a school. So I'm trying to support my 363 kids that I have on enrolled in our school, in addition to all of our teachers and staff, and then a first grader and a second grader. Was really hard, especially because technology was a challenge and trying to help them navigate that. And because this is all information they haven't learned, it was hard just scheduling wise, because they were on two different schedules, had questions about everything. And I'm trying to do walkthroughs so I can support our teachers in a virtual setting. And, it became a lot and it became too much. I noticed my focus was split, and so my decision making wasn't the greatest in work, and my decision making at home wasn't always the best, and it put a strain on the relationship with my kids as well, because now I'm trying to have to teach and parent, and those two different worlds are very, very different. And so it was really a challenge, and I had to make the decision for myself and for my kids that they went back to school this past week. And so it's been hard, because I worry about them. I worry about the staff members that are working with them. But at the same time, I need to do what's best for them. And I also have to take a look at doing what's best here for my campus.
Yeah, that's definitely a balancing act, right? Of understanding both sides of that challenge, with the parents' point of view, but also the educator's point of view. Ryan, what about you? You have 3 kids, right? What is a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a 13-year-old,
Yes.
who I know some of them are off camera right now with your husband.
Yes. Yeah,
how has that been?
Yeah, that the balancing act has really been something that has been a struggle, especially because, virtual learning at the end of last school year and virtual learning the beginning of this school year are very different, right? So we weren't prepared last school year, but we were better prepared this school year. So the demands, the expectation of everybody, including, your children as students, and then you as a leader, it has shifted. And so we are fully virtual, but I have to go into the building a hybrid model. So a few days out the week, I'm required to go into the building, and my children have to come with me sometimes, mainly my 4-year-old, because I don't have someone to support her with distance learning, because my husband is a police officer. So he has a high demanding job. I have a high demanding job. We have a 1-year-old. So just trying to balance, and it has definitely been tough making sure that I am evenly splitting my time, my attention to my children, and then also, my students, the parents, my staff. And I had to take a step back and intentionally block out time in my schedule for my children. And my secretary, my staff, they know that I have sacred time built in my schedule, because I realized that my 4-year-old, she was struggling seeing all of her other classmates have their parents sit in the screen with them, and they're helping them. And she's definitely independent. So she's able to do the things by herself, but she wanted me there because she sees all of her classmates there. So it has definitely been a challenge just trying to find the balance, because in one way, you think you may be doing great as a principal, but then you're getting like a C+ as a mom, or vice versa. And so I've just had to really figure out what works for my family, what works for my building. I lead with love. I lead with a focus on family. So I am constantly giving my staff opportunities where they can spend time with their children, because I have a lot of teachers that are parents, and I know the struggle. So I try to normalize us working at home. So my children have been in every staff meeting and every PD. We had one this morning, and they were there, and they were like, hi, just saying hi to, my staff. And, I make it so that, like, it's okay. Don't apologize for having your children right there, because we are all still trying to navigate through this. And, we're trying to figure out the best way to do this. So it has definitely been tough, just trying to figure out what works for me as a leader, and then what works for me as a mom as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Lonnie, what has worked for you with your 2 kids in pre-K?
Well, if anyone knows what works with a 2 and a 5-year-old, please give me the advice, because what didn't work was when the day I had to lead the staff meeting, and I had the Sharpie in the top drawer, and I thought they were being wonderful. I just thought they weren't. I didn't even have to have cartoons on. They were fine. And my bedroom walls took a beating all over. And immediately it's just the letdown of, you made it through this very important part of your day. You gave everything you had to your students. You feel like a wonderful worker, and you walk into that room, and to see the Sharpie all over the wall, I just bawled. I just started crying, because at that point it was like, darn it. I thought I did it. I thought I had it in this moment, and I did not. So that was my experience from home. My kids had to go back, because I have to be here, and that it's hard. We have some vulnerable people in our family, and it's an everyday battle to try to you feel really good. And like I said, it's in our community, it's come in waves. And so it gets scary from time to time. And my husband's one of only a few attorneys in town, so his job is pretty high demanding as well. Kudos to the moms out there. I think it's no joke, and this isn't a secret that the emotional labor of school has far been put on the moms. And I remind my teachers of that daily. When they call home, guess who they call? They call mom. They don't think twice about it. It is just instinctual that what we put on the mothers as far as education. So you throw a mom that's also a teacher or works in education, administrator or school counselor, into the pandemic, where we're now, we're the emotional labor of the education. We're the cook, we're the chef, we're the caretaker. It is a lot for everybody. So I got my walls painted. We're good. All is well in my house. But yep, my kiddos are back now, and they really needed some social interaction as well, physical touch, some of those things I think 2 and 5-year-olds really yearn for during this pandemic. So they're doing very well, and so are my walls.
Great. Well, happy for your walls.
So look, even when you're in the grandmother stage, which is kind of where I am, the whole notion of not seeing everybody. So it's the day-to-day stuff that Ryan and Tanya and Lonnie talked about, but it's also this kind of long-term social isolation that everybody is feeling right now. And that families, not being able to, if families don't live close to each other, even over the summer, not being able to see each other, not being able to hug each other, not being able to do the kind of rituals that families do all over the course of the year. So that all of this, the fact that COVID has lasted for so long, and we're now going into another spike, well-being of people all across America, not just in terms of schools, but the whole notion of well-being and dealing with social isolation, this is going to be with us for a while, and we're going to have a lot of grace, and we're going to have to think through, and this is part of the resource issue, how we get wraparound services around each and every school. Like, so Lonnie is not the only guidance counselor that's dealing in a Nebraska school, that Ryan has guidance counselors there, that we have, Tanya has social service supports. And so, that's part of this, is not simply getting like childcare grants, which we need to have so that women can balance work and kids and things like that. But it's going to go deeper than the economics. It's going to be really deep in terms of Maslowian social needs because of all of this isolation.
Yeah, and I think one of the really big issues that has come out of this, that we were sort of honestly expecting before the start of the school year, was how, and we have seen this already play out, how the pandemic has exacerbated existing inequities in our country and in every facet of it, and certainly in the school system and certainly in education. I wanted to hear a little bit from you all as well about, now that we are a few weeks in, what are some of those persisting challenges, those things that you're still facing day to day, particularly with technology, I think in some cases, that you're still dealing with? And do you have a better roadmap now on how to address some of those so that some students are not being left behind? Ryan, do you want to go first? I know you're at a Title I school, right?
Yes. So my school is a Title I school, but we are also about 61% ELL population, where the majority of my family's English is their second language. And so that has definitely been the biggest challenge, is that our students, they don't have the support at home of someone that can understand the language, can help them with, one, navigating technology that is sometimes not even at the most advanced level, but it's basic technology that their families are just not, they don't understand. And then now having to help them with the language. So that has definitely been the biggest challenge. My staff and I talk a lot about this. The pandemic has really shown us the inequities, the digital divide, the linguistic challenges that we are facing. Like, we knew, but now we really know. And then for me, I have, as a Title I school, a lot of my families have been impacted by COVID and they are not working. So when we have opportunities where they can come to the school to get meals, when they can come to the school to get any resource as far as paper and pencils and just, manipulatives, my line is wrapped around the parking lot. Right. And so those are challenges that we had to prepare for. And so, one of the shift for us is that we learned what worked and what didn't work at the end of last school year. And we were very fortunate to have a great start of distance learning, which we joked about even this morning, that almost kind of has put us in a tough spot, because our families have this expectation of us, because, we did so well in the springtime. So what we've done definitely in the beginning of this school year is that we provided student resource kits that had everything that they could possibly need for distance learning. And we looked at the curriculum for the first semester, for the first quarter, by week, and we thought of different things that we had in the building, and we just started pulling stuff from classrooms, creating these kits, everything from crowns and pencils and construction paper to manipulatives for students, whiteboards for students, of course their textbooks, gave them headphones. We are one-to-one when it comes to technology, so making sure that every student had a device. And when the students have difficulties with their devices, we're IT. I sometimes feel I'm more of like an IT call center than the principal. I'm walking parents through, okay, log on this, okay, share this. And then after, a lot of times I'm just like, can I just speak to your student? I'm just going to walk him through it, right? Because it's difficult, but we are really just trying to give our families as much support as possible. We are also a community school, so we provide wraparound services for our students. So we have mental health professionals that support them. We realize that our students are missing the physical touch, that relationship, that engagement. And we are really big on climate and culture in our building. So we are doing daily live morning announcements. We're doing assemblies. We have live socializing blocks. Our school district really has given us the autonomy. Our CEO has designated all principals as COOs of their building. So we had the autonomy to create the schedule that works for our school. And that has really been impactful, because I was able to look at what did not work for us as a community last school year and make those adjustments and give parents breaks within the day, making sure that it is not a 8 to 2 of just sitting in front of the computer, but they give, blocks of time and opportunities. And because I have a high Hispanic and African-American population, I have families that have multiple children. I have parents that are helping other families. So they're babysitting, 2 other children and have 3 of their own in the house. And so keeping that in mind when I'm building schedules so that they can, divide themselves between a kindergarten student and a 5th grade student, right? So keeping all of those things in mind has really kind of helped us navigate through some of the challenges and things that are really out of our control.
Really understanding the challenges that are happening in the home and being kind of a bridge there. What about you, Tanya? I know that hotspots and Wi-Fi and connectivity has been a really big issue for you, for your students as well.
Yes, it has. And that's the biggest challenge in a virtual model, because that's the only way we can deliver instruction. And so when it's not solid 100% of the time, you're going to lose kids because they're missing out on instruction. Our utility authority has been really great in trying to help figure out a system to support all families with internet. But there are some communities that are rural and don't have that great service. And so we are also a 1-to-1 district. So we were fortunate enough to be able to roll out those devices as soon as we went virtual. This year, our superintendent has purchased 200 internet-ready devices. In addition, we do have hotspots, but as I mentioned, where some of our communities are rural, so the reception and the internet connection is really only as good as the cell service in the area. So sometimes that's a challenge. We too, like Ryan, we have multiple children in the family, and that's a struggle when they're all on different schedules and everyone's connected online. We do have some families that requested packets, and that has been an additional challenge, because delivering solid direct instruction over the phone is hard. And our teachers are teaching from 9 to 2. We were also given the autonomy to build a schedule that works best for us. Last year, our students had 8 periods. And so when we went virtual in March, they were so overwhelmed to open up their computers and see 8 different Google Classrooms with all of these assignments. And it was just so overwhelming that some of them said, yeah, I open it and then I see all of these things and then I just close it and I put it away. And so then they're just falling further behind. And so this year they only have 4 classes, but it's still a challenge because, we assume our older kids are tech savvy, and they are with certain technology, but virtual learning is a different set of technology that they're not familiar with. So we spent a lot of time really going through and teaching them how to use Google Classroom, how to use the different online platforms that we have, but it's still a challenge. And, for us, especially my high school students, I worry because they need a certain number of classes that they have to pass in order to graduate. I'm really concerned about my seniors who are, they're already feeling down because this is not how they wanted to spend their senior year. And so, we're also dealing with the social emotional piece of, not being here, not having all of the support that they would normally have coming here. Our counselors are working really hard to set up a system to deliver services virtually. But that's still really challenging because it has to be done either over the phone or on the computer. So I can't just walk into a classroom and pull out a kid and say, hey, I need you to come talk to the counselors. Can I get you to log on to meet with our counselors to provide additional services? And so it's been a challenge. And I'm the only school in our district that is seeing an a rise in numbers for students and families that want to have them come to campus. And so we're supporting in any way that we can, because I want them to do the best that they can in the environment that works for them. And so it's been a journey, but I'm blessed to work with teachers and staff that are willing to be flexible and throw out ideas and try new things, because really that's where we're at. How can we best serve our students? Our reservation is the size of Connecticut, so our kids aren't necessarily in close proximity to our school. So then how do we still provide those outreach services for kids that maybe live an hour away? So we're doing what we can, and we have the support of our superintendent and the governing board and our community members. So I'm really grateful that everyone's putting their heads together to figure out how can we serve our kids and make sure that they're not losing anything this year.
Those are impossible big questions that we're addressing this year and that we're going to be addressing, I think, long term. And so that's where I wanted to take you all now. We've been hearing from educators who are really afraid about the impact a year like this could have on this profession, on the education in general. And what if standardized test scores don't come in well? What if evaluations aren't well? What if our kids are not where we want them to be? Is that going to reflect on parents and students and teachers, or is that going to reflect on this system? So I would love to hear from each of you about what are your fears about how this year will impact education, and where do you think are the opportunities to really learn from the challenges of this moment and improve the system moving forward? Randy, I'd love to start with you on that one.
So I think we have to actually start with saying three things at the same time. Number one, there are Herculean efforts that are being made by the educators like those you have on this Zoom, by educators all across America. Herculean. Whether it was last March, when people kind of moved in a nanosecond to virtual with all the issues that you've just heard, and people kept on trying because teachers and kids have a special connection to each other. They knew each other before. And people kept trying to figure it out and created some sense of normalcy in a very unnormal situation, and some sense of calm and stability, schedules, routines, as well as learning. This year, you have a whole different set of constructs, both virtually and non-virtually. Non-virtually, it's nightmarish for a lot of teachers who are in school right now, because the one idea that actually has to be thrown out is you cannot live stream teach. You can live stream perform, but you cannot live stream teach and also teach in person at the same time and think you're going to reach all kids. It's impossible. And a lot of districts, because of finances, are doing something like that in the hybrid. But this year, and I'm so glad to hear both Ryan and Tanya talk about all the things they're doing in terms of virtual, because this year, teachers don't necessarily know their kids like they knew their kids last year. And that creates a whole nother set of situations. So the fact that, and I'm sorry to be critical about this, but the fact that the only guidance that Betsy DeVos put out was, oh, by the way, there will be standardized tests this year. It became laughable to everyone, because we do actually have to figure out how to, measure this year and figure out where our kids are. But that's the first piece of guidance, as opposed to how are we going to make sure that our kids have well-being? How do we make sure we protect them? How do we make sure we create routines and standards and make sure they feel like they're safe? And so what teacher unions are saying around the country, and teachers are saying, is this year is going to be different than hopefully than any other year forthcoming. Hopefully we'll get out of this. But we got to figure out how to give people feedback about what to do this year. But it's not about how to evaluate them or create accountability. We got to figure out how to make this year a bridge year so that kids are safe, teachers feel safe, and that we actually try to create routines in a way that's welcoming and that they feel like they're going to be okay and get some learning. And if we do that, then we're going to find pathways as every single one of these educators are showing you, pathways to learning.
Yeah, I agree, Randy. I know my staff and I talked about that. What we thought was normal is going to change. Education changes now as we move forward. Our thinking, our mindset has to shift. And, the way we used to operate as school districts is going to change. Everything from as simple as snow days. We have shown that snow days, they don't exist anymore, because we have shown that, okay, we can virtually teach online. Students have the access. We know what to do. But even, when we come back, I will bring students back to school, everyone may not come back at the same time, right? My 13-year-old is at a school that the teacher is teaching to the students that are at home and the students that are sitting in front of her at the same time, right? And that is something that our teachers have to prepare for the thought of that. We have to prepare for, as elementary, I may not be able to do whole school assemblies anymore. I may have to break it up and only have a certain amount of students at a time. I may not be able to have parents in the building as much as I have before, right? Everything kind of shifts and changes, but, I have been challenging my staff to look at some of the positive things that comes out of, navigating in distance learning, virtual learning, or even how we've had to adjust our practices for teaching and learning, and focus on some of the positive things that we didn't even know we had the capacity to do before this opportunity. And I think it starts with us as the leaders, how we encourage, how we set the example, how we motivate our teachers, to really shift their thinking and prepare themselves for what new and what normal will be as we move forward.
You're making some changes in your school too, right, Tanya?
Yes, absolutely. The other three campuses in our district, their leadership team and our leadership team sat down and took a look at what the expectation was, because our teachers have teacher performance goals in order to receive 301 money. Evaluation is a part of the system in order to determine whether or not you get 100%, 80%, or none at all. And so, it was really, how do we support our teachers? Because we want them to keep pushing through, want them to, take those risks. And yes, some of them will pay off big and some of them may crash and burn, but that's okay, because at least they're trying new things in order to reach our students. And so when we took a look at our evaluation tool, we used the Charlotte Danielson framework with the 22 components. That is a lot to evaluate in a virtual setting. And so the message for us is, this evaluation tool is not evaluating who you are as a classroom teacher, because it is very, very different to be a classroom teacher and a virtual teacher. It's really going to take a look at how you are as a brand new virtual teacher. And so we sat down as a leadership team with my campus and then the other campuses to come up with the modified version of what that looks like. A lot of the things that teachers are doing already, it's just now strengthening those pieces in a virtual setting, because there was a lot of anxiety about evaluations this year and what's that going to mean, not only for their 301 money, but for their jobs for the upcoming year. And we just really wanted to communicate that, it's not going to be solely based on this year, because it can't be, because everyone's learning. And, I don't have a single teacher who's not trying new things. I don't have a single teacher who's resistant to making those modifications. So the best thing I can do and my leadership can do is support. So we do a lot of walkthroughs to support that. And we've shifted how we conduct those walkthroughs, so that way we're providing them with real strategies for being in those effective categories, because none of our teachers want to be ineffective or developing. They really want to work to being the best possible teacher they can. And so I think we've kind of relaxed their feelings about it, because now their anxiety isn't as high. We're conducting, 2 informal observations before we do the formal, really because we want them to be confident in our ability to score in a virtual setting, because I've never had to, evaluate online before. but then also to give them feedback before that formal, and so they can knock it out of the ballpark, in the spring.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want you to round us out here, Lonnie, on the mental health aspect, from the counselor aspect. That's something that students, teachers, parents, everybody is dealing with this year. What can we really learn to improve some of those outcomes for everybody?
Well, I've been talking a lot with my students and my parents and community. This discomfort that we're all feeling, it truly is grief. And we all go through stages of grief at different times, which can be challenging when you're trying to be one school counselor in a group of 350 kids, because you might have a kid that's still stuck in anger, or a parent. Why are they making me wear these face masks? This is, I'm going to go to the school board. We might have somebody who's in bargaining, where they're saying, well, we'll wait for a graduation ceremony, or we'll wait for this big event. We'll wait for homecoming. If it's just 2 more weeks, it'll be better. We'll wait for our dances. And you catch it, and you catch this, and it's all stages of grief, right? And we all get to this acceptance at a different phase. And some of what we're feeling right now, and our students are feeling, is anticipatory grief. We are anticipating a very different holiday season again. We are anticipating these things in the future. We do not know how they're going to look, and we can't control them. They're a little bit out of our control. So the number one thing we can do as educators right now is just to stock up on compassion, because that snippy comment by our colleague, whether it be via Zoom or in the teacher's lounge, or a student that's acting out in class, or an administrator who makes a comment that really hurts your feelings, it's nice to step back and look and say, they're in an uncontrollable situation right now. That is grief, and that is stress, and that might even be anticipatory grief. That's not how they usually act. I can find compassion for that to get to the next phase of this, because as Randy said, we are in this for a while, whether we are virtual with our students or in person, or maybe we have to bounce between both in places. We are in this for a while, and to just that stocking up on compassion, and recognize that our students might be grieving, and our parents might be grieving. We talked about moms at home for a little bit. It's really interesting right now for me. There are, especially as my colleagues, there are some that have more to give right now than they have ever given. They're at the phase in the life where they have the time, they have the energy. It was like their call to arms. First it was the nurses and our clerks and our grocery store workers and all these essential workers, and now it's us. And the capacity they have is just huge. And then there's some of us with 2 and 5 and 13-year-olds, and are trying to play these different roles that we're used to giving so much, and now find ourselves in this strapped a little less, and it's confusing. So I think for all of us, just to fill that bucket with compassion, and recognize the grief when it comes, and recognize the stages that we all might be at different ones, depending on the day and the situations in our communities.
Let's just hope that we're all getting a little bit closer to that acceptance stage, right? And, I really want to thank you all so much for this robust conversation. I think this is an absolutely critical conversation to be having, and to keep having as the months continue to go on. So we want to thank you so much for being here with us. And we so appreciate all of the work that you have done, and will continue to do. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you.
For this next segment, we're thrilled to have Chalkbeat story editor Kara Fitzpatrick in conversation with Dr. Joyce Dorado. Dr. Dorado is the director and co-founder of the Healthy Environments and Response to Trauma in Schools program at the University of California, San Francisco. They'll discuss how parents and teachers can best help kids in this unprecedented moment in history.
Thank you, Emily. I'm excited to be here with Joyce. We're going to be talking a little bit about how parents, caregivers, and teachers can help children navigate this moment. So I just wanted to start off with asking if Joyce, can you just talk a little bit about how trauma and stress affect all of us, some examples of it, and what are some of the ways that we can recognize stress in ourselves and also in the children in our lives?
Thanks, Kara, and to the 19th for inviting me to speak today. Well, I just want to name that for most of us, we are all experiencing a collective trauma around the COVID-19 pandemic. We're entering the 8th month of this pandemic. So what started off as this like initial panic and intense worry and fear has kind of settled into kind of a chronic worry and anxiety and fear around getting sick, around losing our loved ones, around losing our jobs, our housing. And the pandemic is on top of other stressors that people may already have been experiencing, including the stress and trauma-inducing nature of systemic racism and xenophobia. We know the pandemic is hardest on people who don't have stable incomes and access to fewer resources, including our essential workers who go to work every day to stock our grocery stores and make and serve our food. And I just want to say that it's normal. It's totally normal to feel scared, to feel anxious, to feel frustrated, to feel grief at having to let go of what we had hoped to be our lives right now. And it's important to our health and our healing to accept, acknowledge, and name these feelings, because you got to name them to tame them. You got to name these feelings to metabolize them. The fact is, overwhelming stress and trauma can have a wear and tear effect on our brains and our bodies. It can cause medical illnesses like inflammatory diseases, asthma, even eczema, immune system difficulties. It can make it hard for us to think clearly and to remember things well. Again, I don't know how many times this has happened to you, Kara, but just I walk into the kitchen and I'm like, and why am I here? I can't remember. It's that I'm starting to call that COVID brain, even if you haven't actually had the illness. The slow IV drip of stress has that wear and tear on our bodies. And it can show up in terms of our behavior and our kids' behavior, in terms of being more irritable, feeling, less patient, more short-tempered, feeling sad and depressed, anxious and scared. And so that's the bad news. But there's good news too, because the fact is science has given us many ways to cope with stress and to be resilient in the face of all of these adversities. It's absolutely possible to overcome and to heal from stress and trauma. And actually what we know is that when we're given the chance to heal and overcome trauma, that we can come back on the other side stronger, wiser, more compassionate than where we were before. People talk about that as post-traumatic growth. We tend as human beings to heal better from collective trauma than individual trauma, because we can all together, right, acknowledge what we're going through and work together to overcome it. And I just also want to say that we're going to talk about some tips today. And if those tips are not enough to help you or your children or your students feel better, and you're really struggling with an intense amount of anxiety or depression or other sorts of adversities, I really encourage you to get some professional help. You get to feel better, and there really is, it's possible to heal with help. So let me just say a little bit of word about anxiety. How about that? So here's the deal. Some anxiety is actually good for us. It helps us to overcome challenges that we have. So like with the situation of COVID, for example, if someone doesn't have enough anxiety about it, then it can cause us to behave irresponsibly, right? Not keep social distance from each other, not wash our hands a lot, right? If we've got the optimal amount of stress, then that actually helps us to gives us the energy to sort of muster ourselves, right? But if we have sort of too much overwhelming stress, it can actually make it hard to think clearly and to do the right thing. It can cause us to do stuff that we regret later, like panic buying or, yelling at our kids or something like that, right? So I find that it's sometimes helpful for people to know what's going on under the hood for themselves and their kids and their students. So there's this thing called the hand model of the brain that that lots of people talk about, including Dan Siegel. And if you sort of hold your hand up, you've got a model of the brain in the palm of your hand. You can even do this when you care if you want. You hold up your hand. Down here is this sort of like hind brain. It's this part of our brain. And if you fold your thumb over, that's the midbrain. This part of our brain is in charge of survival and really strong feelings, okay? And then if you fold your fingers over here, and this lines up with your forehead and your frontal lobe, this is a part of our brain that's in charge of thinking and planning If you wiggle your thumb while you've got your fingers over that, that's you having a feeling. And because my frontal lobe, my thinking brain is like nicely integrated, I can express that feeling and modulate it, change it to fit the situation at hand. But when we're under enormous amounts of stress and we get super stressed out or triggered by a reminder of a trauma that we've had, what happens is we flip our lids and our thinking brain largely goes offline, and this survival emotional brain takes over, right? So we teach this actually even to little kids because they can tell us, Mom, right? Mom, I'm flipping my lid. Or Mom, you seem to be flipping your lid. What can we do to try to get our lids back on? So I think it's really helpful actually to teach kids what happens to our brains and bodies, and that it can happen to any of us. And it's important for us to remember that when we as adults flip our lids with our kids, our students, we can actually inadvertently cause harm because we have power over them as adults and they're dependent on us to take care of them. So those are some of the ways that stress and trauma can affect us.
Thank you. I mean, this is highly relatable for me as a mother of 3 young children with at home right now and no childcare. I think it's also a good segue into my next question, which was how can we as caregivers create a sense of safety and well-being for the children in our lives, both physically and emotionally?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. And so first of all, I want to say that just like they say on airplanes, like when we used to fly before, you have to put your own mask on right before you put on the mask of the person next to you or your child. The fact is, it's really important for us as adults, as parents, caregivers, teachers, to take really good care of ourselves and to ask for help when we need it. Because in order for us to be a calm, reassuring presence for our kids, we need to feel calm and we need to feel cared for ourselves. So what can we do to take good care of ourselves and each other as adults? So that being said, here's some science-based tips that can work for adults and for kids. So one thing that happens when we feel a lot of stress is these stress neurochemicals build up in our bodies and brains. And so we need to do it whatever we can to metabolize those stress neurochemicals so that they don't just sit there and make us sick, right? So quick physiological breaks, like deep breaths, like we can just do this right now. Take a nice deep breath in through your nose and blow out through your mouth, like you're blowing through a straw, right? And make sure exhale is longer than your inhale. That deep breath actually helps me, get my lid back on and my thinking brain back on. And it helps metabolize those stress neurochemicals. We can do things like stretch, exercise, even taking a walk. All of that stuff actually helps us to metabolize that stress so that it doesn't just build and build and build and build and make us, medically ill. It's really important to protect your sleep and your children's sleep. Sleep helps our body metabolize stress. And did you know that a few days of less than 6 hours of sleep makes our brain operate as though we're like basically legally drunk if we'd be pulled over for drunk driving? So it's an important thing to know, right? There's some other really good tips from a resource that I want your listeners, your watchers to know. It's from the UC Berkeley Greater Good Science Center. And they talk about this science-based thing of like small bursts of positive emotion, creating those for yourself and for your children can really help to mitigate the effects of stress. So things like joy and compassion and a sense of awe, to laugh together about things. Gratitude is an incredibly helpful habit to get into. As bad as things are, frankly, there's always something that we can be grateful for. I can be grateful that I am breathing. I can be grateful that for me, I have the privilege of living in a home. Right now, in this moment, I am safe. I can be grateful for that, right? And what we know is that practicing gratitude can do things like lower our blood pressure and make us feel like less depressed and less isolated. So those are some tips. Some others that are science-based is really connection, right? So toxic stress can be like poison, but love is the medicine. We're actually hardwired for love, for caring, to help calm us down when we're stressed out, to help us heal from adversity and trauma. And so more than ever, even though we have to have this physical distance from each other, it's important for us to connect, right? And to create times for our kids to connect. And whether that's outside, you know, with some distance, there's some science now that's telling us that being outside is like, if you can do it, there are ways to safely be outside if you've got distance and be able to see each other with your eyeballs, right? Go for a walk, that sort of a thing. Then you get a twofer of connection and some movement, right? And even things like telephone, Zoom, calling friends and family, having your kids call your elderly relatives, that gives them both a sense of purpose and that nice connection. And it's really good for your elderly relatives too. So how do we connect on an everyday basis? There's a couple more if you'd like me to share them. That are quick. And what I'm trying to do is give folks like quick and easy things to do. You don't have to like be an expert to do them. You don't need like hours and hours a day. But so creating a habit of kindness. Did you know that altruistic acts, those kind things we do for others, not expecting anything in return, actually activate the pleasure centers in our brain and are really good for our brains and bodies. So being in the habit of being kind and helpful to others, and just knowing that we're all up against a lot, right? So what can we do to extend grace and compassion to other people when somebody is acting in a way that's like frustrating? To be thinking to myself, okay, this person is really, really stressed out. I get it, and I'm going to do everything we can to try to help them with that stress instead of reacting to them and sort of maybe making it worse. In terms of, you know, dealing with your kids, did you have?
No, I was gonna say with kids, I think that's it's very important, and I'm glad you mentioned the time element, because I think many of us with children feel like we don't have enough time for anything. And so I've been trying, and I don't know if this is the right thing, so I'm hoping you can tell me, but I've been trying to focus on small moments. You know, my 6-year-old likes to climb into my lap at the beginning of the day and have a moment with me. And I try really hard to make sure that I do that small thing because it seems to be something he needs. And then at least I can feel like we had that moment, you know, whatever happens the rest of the day.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Exactly. Finding those small moments, those, you know, reaching over and squeezing somebody's hand, you know, giving them a pat on the shoulder. Those very small moments of joy, connection, can really help our kids and help us.
One thing I wanted to go back to that you mentioned before that I think is really important right now is talking about, you know, some of the ways that communities of color have been hit hard by the pandemic, and also the national uprising essentially that our country is having around race and racism. And I know that this is something I've struggled with a little bit as a parent about how to talk to my children about some of the things that are going on in the news, whether to talk to them about it, you know, how to do it on their level. And so I'm just wondering, you know, two things. How can caregivers have some of those conversations? And then how should teachers respond to students who've been directly affected by systemic racism or who've seen some of this news coverage about the protests around police brutality and systemic racism?
Sure. Thanks for asking that. I mean, you really are highlighting that this pandemic is, you know, really showing a bright light on glaring inequities that have been in place in our countries really since the beginning. And it's really important to also know that stress and fear actually make us even more vulnerable to enacting the implicit biases that we all have. So it's kind of making things worse. Like there's in addition to the anti-Black racism that is so clearly, we can see so clearly with what's been happening, there's also been a rise in xenophobic biases and violence towards Asians and Asian Americans. So in terms of what I think we can do with our kids is, first of all, recognize that we are currently in the middle of a massive call to action, right? To try to address those inequities and to invite our children to think about that with us. You know, even little kids can see the difference between the color of people's skins and how people are treated. So even if we think they don't know, they know, right? They can see it on TV. They've seen it before the pandemic in terms of how classmates are treated or how they're treated differently. It's there. So I really encourage folks to talk to our kids directly about this. I mean, it can be a really tricky conversation. The good news is there's lots of really great resources out there now, and especially since the social justice uprising. And I want to point folks to some books and videos that can be really helpful if you're nervous about having that conversation with your kids. It's totally possible. You may or may not have seen it. Sesame Street had a special on coming together and standing up to racism, which is super kid appropriate and like does a lot of talking about like, what is race and what is racism and what can we do about it together? For teachers, and also for parents, there's a website called embracerace.org that has really helpful books and tips. So you don't have to do this alone, I would say. I would say practice what you want to say with another adult. Like if you're nervous about it, like practice having the words come out of your mouth and have somebody ask you questions. Because when they can see that we are comfortable talking about this, that's going to make it possible for them to name how they're feeling about it, right? In some ways, the most important thing for us in terms of this, as well as in terms of helping our children deal with any sort of adversity, is to make sure that we're creating and maintaining a really strong, open communication, right, between us. And how we do that is that we let them ask us questions. We answer them as honestly as we can. We stay calm and we stay curious, you know, and if we're sort of wondering about something, just be, I'm wondering, can you tell me a little bit more about that? Or, you know, ask them, so what have you heard about this? Right, and you can hear how they use their words, and then you can try to build on that. And really, if you don't have the answer, you know, well, how do we fix this? Why do people do things like this? What does it mean? You know, you can say, listen, I'm learning about this too right now. And how about we learn about it together? Let's try to find the answer together. Now, obviously, the conversation is going to be different with your children depending on their skin you're in. So that's another thing to attend to. Sometimes you're naming the experiences that your child has had or that you've had. Other times you're trying to build empathy for the experience that other people have had, right? And ultimately, I think it's so important, both with the pandemic and with the COVID pandemic and this, we need to instill hope, right? The fact is, our ancestors, my ancestors, have overcome so much. And part of what gives me strength is kind of leaning in to the strength of my people and what they've done to overcome adversity. And we know now that people are coming together to really stand up to this. I feel tremendous hope when I look at our young people and how they push us to be better as a society. And so how can we empower them to be active, engaged, future citizens of the world, right? There's a quote I really like from Brian Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy, and who's the founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. And he says, hope is your superpower. Don't let anybody or anything make you hopeless. Hope is the enemy of injustice. Hope is what will get you to stand up when people tell you to sit down. So how do we build a narrative with our children about how we have come together to overcome the adversities of the pandemic and to overcome, right, these sorts of inequities? That will give them resilience that they'll be able to carry forward into other adversities that they face.
I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I think that is one of the things that I struggle with a little bit, and I think a lot of people are right now, is how, you know, not to scare our children, talk to them about some of these things, and then, you know, how much hope we can give them about, you know, how things are going and whether or not things will get better. So I think that helps a lot. We also, my children and I, we watched, just by coincidence, it happened to be on a PBS program that was about John Lewis, and it was before his death. He was involved in it, and it just happened to be on. My children watched it, and one of the questions I got from my 7-year-old was why it was wrong, you know, why Rosa Parks could get arrested basically for not giving up her seat. And And I don't think that would have come up otherwise. And I thought that was such a nice way for us to sort of talk about it based on watching the TV program. So I'm glad you mentioned
fantastic. Yeah, that's great. You know, and teachers, part of being a teacher, right, is teaching. If you're a history, you know, especially if you're a history teacher or an elementary school teacher that teaches everything, is really teaching the history, right, of both injustices, terrible injustices that have happened in our country, as well as the sort of social justice movements that have really come forward to overcome it, and people like John Lewis, right? I think that when we talk about those things, it does give opportunities to discuss. It also helps our students of color feel seen and heard and affirmed, right? And if you're an educator, I think it's actually incumbent upon us to teach our kids about this. The fact is that silence around, you know, things that are happening right now in terms of injustice can be read and experienced as complicity in our students. And when our students worry that we as adults don't have awareness around our own biases, don't have awareness around our own power and privilege, aren't paying attention to or feeling outraged about violence against Black and brown people and against any people, right? But especially in the context of this, Black and brown people, that can be read as, as complicity. And it can leave as complicity, that's the word. And it can leave our students in a state of kind of brace for impact mode, because they don't know when maybe a microaggression is going to come from you, or something that you say that devalues their experience, and then it's impossible to learn. So actually that sort of being aware becomes a crucial component of being an educator. There's a lot of good resources out there, and we can maybe share them with your audience. But the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a tip sheet addressing race and trauma in the classroom. There's a great resource called Empowering Educators, which is a guidebook and videos around how to do this work in classrooms. Courageous Conversations is a book that and sort of a set of materials that can help teachers talk about these things in their classrooms. So lots and lots out there.
That's fantastic. Thank you for mentioning that. I wanted to, because this event is around education, I wanted to talk about the fact that remote learning is not working well for a lot of families, but especially in some of these same communities of color. And there's also this very understandable fear that a lot of people in those communities have about the ability of the schools to keep their children safe. And so I think, it's a very big issue. But I want to talk sort of on a practical level about how teachers and caregivers can build trust with each other. Because I think we understand those relationships a little better than thinking about the entire system. But how can I approach my child's teacher, or how can they approach me to build some trust?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're asking this question, because I think a key to being able to engage our kids in education, whether it's remotely or in person, is to build mutual empathy and respect between caregivers and educators, right? That when things are going sideways and we're just like, as a parent, like, gosh, why haven't they told me the plan yet? And it's so frustrating, right? For me to try to pause and realize that the educators are up against the same sorts of things that I'm up against. Maybe even more so, and that people are doing the level best to do the best they can, given the deck of cards they've been handed. And so I try to think about when somebody is acting in a way that is bumming me out, instead of what is wrong with you? What are you doing? I try to think, what has happened to you, right? What's happening to you? And that gives me maybe some context for the behavior, and it helps me feel more compassionate, and it helps me just be more effective in terms of how we're dealing with it. I think in terms of concrete strategies, it's really important I've seen schools do this really great thing where they're creating predictable, regular times where parents and caregivers can come and ask them questions, express their concerns, maybe have some ideas about how to do things better. Sometimes that can happen in a town hall in a school. It can happen in terms of weekly principal chats. But if there's some predictable, regular time, right, then parents will be able to count on that and to feel seen and heard. And similarly, actually, with teachers and educators, that there be predictable, regular time that they can voice to their bosses, to the principals, to the district, what's going right, how do we need to adjust, what do I need to get support, that we need to support our teachers, our educators, so that they can support our kids, right? All the way up to the sort of educational hierarchy. I think it's also really helpful for teachers to have some quick, easy, super easy way to regularly just catch kids being good, like doing good things, and then be able to like report that to the parents, right? There are apps that do that where it's just like a quick like smiley face to the parent, your kid just did a great thing, or like your kid just like, and that is reassuring to parents, and it helps parents see that the educators see and hear and care about their kids, and it helps the kids too. So anything that can help create that connection, that mutual respect, that mutual empathy, and that regular transparent communication, I think is what's needed.
That's great. That's really helpful, actually. Yeah. One thing, and I think we're probably nearing our time here, but one thing I wanted to bring up that I think is helpful for everyone, but it's just this sense that, at the start of the pandemic, I think we were hoping it would be over in a short period of time. And then, we went through the remote learning, and then we sort of went into the summer hoping that we would, start seeing an end. And I think at this point, it's starting to feel like, okay, this could be another year. We don't know. And I wonder how do we as adults deal with the sense of just not knowing and not being able to plan?
Yep. So when you said that, like, I just got a big, like, and let's all just take a nice deep breath in, right? Someday this will end. Here's the thing. We absolutely live in these totally unpredictable, unprecedented times. We have no idea when this is really going to be all the way over. And so one of the ways we can deal with all of this unpredictability is to try to create as much predictability as we can in our daily lives. So for example, co-creating a routine with your students and with your kids, so that there's some predictability during the day. In the morning, we're going to get up around this time. We'll have a meal together around this time. Here's when we're going to go for a walk and get some exercise. Every Saturday we have game night. Things that like can add some like benchmarks, some milestones, some predictability to the day and to the week can really help. Also, what we know is that when we have a sense of voice, choice, agency over our universe, we're healthier, we're happier, we're more productive, and just generally having a sense of control over what stresses us out can mitigate the effects of stress, even on a cellular level, like in our brains and bodies. So how do we do that in the middle of a pandemic and everything that's happening? Well, one thing, and I learned this from the Greater Good Science Center and other folks, is that it can be very helpful to focus on what you can control, okay? So we've got this sort of like circle of stuff that we can control. And then we have larger things that we can't control. So I can focus on what I can control. I cannot control when the pandemic is going to end. I cannot predict that. I cannot control whether those people way over there are practicing social distancing or wearing their masks. I can't control those things. What I can control is how I interact with people. What I can control is if I'm wearing my mask or not, right? What I can control is how I deal with the news. Can I limit, my exposure to the bad news and actually try to actively seek out good news, like from the Happy Broadcast channel. What I can control is I can meditate, I can exercise, I can take care of my brain and body. I can call my friends, right? I can act kindly towards the grocery store clerk, right? So really trying to focus on what I can control and letting go as much as I can about what I can't control, and teaching our kids how to do that too, can give us a measure of a sense of agency inside this incredibly unpredictable situation. And again, there's really good science behind that.
No, I think that's helpful. And I appreciate very much that throughout this conversation, you're very positive, you're very focused on hope. So that's useful for me and many others. And I think I wondered if you had any closing thoughts or last message you might want to share.
Yeah, thank you. You know, I guess I want to say that resilience, and what gives us resilience, is the ability to face down and name, right, the often brutal reality what is, and also maintaining a staunch optimism that we can overcome it. For many of us, we already know what it feels like to overcome adversity. We also know as parents and caregivers, like our role is super important, right? What's the most highly correlated factor with overcoming childhood adversity is having a caring adult in your life, a stable, caring adult who loves you, warts and all, no matter what, and who believes in you, right? And so we get to be that for our kids. And we get to draw on the strength of the people who love us to give us the strength to do that. The fact is, we are in the middle of incredibly difficult times, and there's going to be a lot of tough times ahead. But I truly believe, personally and professionally, that if we can work together, if we can show our children with our actions and our words how we can act in a thoughtful, intentional way to help each other, if we can be guided by love and compassion, if we can reflect with our kids about what we're learning during this pandemic as we move through this, that we really can come out the other side together as families, as relationships, as society, stronger, wiser, more compassionate, where we can create a new normal that works for everyone and not just for some, and where we can use what we've learned during the pandemic to face the adversities and be able to overcome them in the future. So I feel extremely hopeful, honestly.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to all of the speakers, panelists, and performers who participated in today's 19th Represents event. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. If you liked what you saw today, we'd love it if you'd join us as members of the 19th. We're a member-supported newsroom, and we can't put on programming like this without your support. Even $19 helps. You can make a gift at 19thnews.org. If you missed any part of the program today or you want to rewatch, visit 19thnews.org/events. A special thanks again to our generous sponsors, philanthropic partners, and media partners: the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Raise Your Hand Texas, the RISA Foundation, and Chalkbeat. We hope to see you all again at one of our upcoming events.